A pink dog with enormous eyes sits frozen at the farmhouse window, watching the desert stretch into forever. This is Courage. Abandoned as a puppy, adopted by kindness, and now the only thing standing between his elderly owner and the monsters that keep finding their way to Nowhere, Kansas. From the very first knock on the door to the final curse that tries to claim the Bag family, this is the entire Courage the Cowardly Dog timeline. A journey through 4 seasons of supernatural horror, strange visitors, and a terrified little dog who somehow keeps saving the day. We'll move through every era, every villain, every nightmare that knocked on that farmhouse door. No analysis or trivia, just one long story of fear, love, and survival in the middle of nowhere. Whether Courage faced giant insects, ancient curses, or smooth-talking con artists, one question stayed the same throughout every episode. How does the most frightened dog in the world keep finding the courage to act? Courage didn't choose the farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. He ended up there because nowhere else wanted him. As a puppy, he was abandoned on a cold street, alone and shaking, until an elderly woman named Muriel Bag found him. She scooped him up with gentle hands, brought him home, and gave him a name that felt too big for such a frightened little creature. Her husband, Eustace Bag, made it clear from the start that he didn't share her kindness. Eustace was a bitter, greedy farmer who saw Courage as a nuisance, a stupid dog who took up space and gave nothing back. But Muriel loved Courage, and that love became the dog's entire world. The farmhouse itself sat alone in a flat, endless stretch of Kansas desert. There were no neighbors, no nearby towns, just wind and dust and the occasional tumbleweed rolling past. The closest thing to civilization was a small general store run by a quiet old man, and even that felt too far to matter. Courage quickly learned that Nowhere wasn't just the name of the place. It was a description. The land felt forgotten, like the world had stopped paying attention to this little corner of Kansas, and anything could wander in without anyone noticing. And wander in, things did. Almost immediately after Courage arrived, the farmhouse became a magnet for the strange and the dangerous. It started small. Odd sounds at night, shadows moving where no shadows should be, packages arriving at the door with no return address. Muriel would smile and say it was probably nothing. Eustace would grumble and go back to his chair. But Courage saw everything, and he understood what the humans didn't. Nowhere wasn't empty. It was full of things that shouldn't exist, and they all seemed to know where the Bag family lived. One of the earliest threats came in the form of a mysterious visitor who arrived with a polite knock and a friendly smile. Courage's instincts screamed danger, but Muriel, ever trusting, invited the stranger inside. What followed was a pattern that would repeat itself over and over. Courage would panic, try to warn his owners, and be ignored or scolded by Eustace for making noise. The visitor would reveal their true nature, something monstrous, something wrong, and Courage would be forced to act alone. He didn't have size or strength or even a clear plan most of the time. What he had was desperation and a refusal to let anything hurt Muriel. That first encounter ended with Courage barely managing to drive the threat away using whatever he could find around the house. A frying pan, a chair, his own small body thrown between Muriel and danger. When it was over, Muriel patted his head and told him he was a good dog. Eustace called him stupid and went to bed. The house returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. But Courage knew better. He could feel it in the air, in the way the wind moved through the desert at night. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. In those early days, Courage learned the rhythm of survival in Nowhere. Danger didn't always announce itself with growls or roars. Sometimes it arrived quietly, disguised as something harmless. A traveling salesman, a lost tourist, a friendly neighbor who didn't exist the day before. Muriel's kindness made her an easy target because she genuinely believed people were good until proven otherwise. Eustace's greed made him a target too, because he would ignore every warning sign if he thought there was something in it for him. And Courage, stuck between the two of them, became the household's reluctant protector. The threats came in waves. Some were creatures, giant insects, mutated animals, things that crawled up from underground or fell from the sky. Others were more human-shaped, but no less monstrous, people who smiled too wide and spoke too smoothly, who had plans that required the Bag family to suffer. Courage didn't understand why Nowhere attracted so much danger. Maybe it was the isolation, the way the farmhouse sat exposed and alone. Maybe it was something older, something buried in the land itself. Either way, the rule became clear. If you lived in Nowhere, trouble would find you, and if you were Courage, you didn't get to run away from it. Every encounter taught Courage something new. He learned that screaming didn't help. Nobody believed him. He learned that running to Muriel only put her in more danger because she would try to comfort him instead of protecting herself. He learned that Eustace would never help, not unless the threat was directly hurting him, and even then, he'd probably just complain. So Courage started adapting. He paid attention to details the humans missed. He watched for patterns. He memorized which hiding spots in the house were safest, which objects could be used as weapons, which exits led to open ground, and which led to dead ends. And through it all, Muriel remained his anchor. She didn't understand the dangers Courage saw, but she trusted him in her own quiet way. When he barked at a stranger, she would at least hesitate before letting them in. When he pulled at her dress, trying to lead her away from something, she would follow, even if she didn't know why. That trust, small as it was, gave Courage the strength to keep acting. He wasn't brave because he wanted to be. He was brave because Muriel needed him to be, and he couldn't imagine a world where he let her down. As the weeks turned into months, the farmhouse became a battlefield that reset itself after every fight. Windows would shatter, furniture would break, walls would crack, and then, somehow, by the next morning, everything would be back to normal. Muriel would make breakfast. Eustace would read his newspaper. Courage would sit by the door, waiting for the next knock. The cycle never stopped. Nowhere never learned. And Courage, terrified and exhausted, kept standing guard anyway. Courage started to notice a pattern in the way danger arrived. It never burst through the walls or dropped from the ceiling without warning. It knocked. It rang the doorbell. It showed up at the front door with a story that sounded reasonable, a problem that seemed solvable, or a face that looked friendly enough to trust. And every single time, Muriel or Eustace would open the door without hesitation, because they still believed the world was a normal place where visitors were just visitors. One of the earliest examples came with a mysterious package delivered to the farmhouse. Courage watched as the mailman left a large crate on the doorstep, addressed to the Bag family, but with no sender information. Muriel was delighted. She loved surprises. Eustace was suspicious, but curious enough to help her drag it inside. Courage, on the other hand, could sense something wrong the moment the package crossed the threshold. The crate smelled strange, old and damp, like it had been buried somewhere and only recently dug up. He barked and pawed at Muriel's leg, trying to warn her, but she just smiled and patted his head. When they opened the crate, what emerged wasn't a gift. It was something ancient and angry, something that had been sealed away for a reason. Courage couldn't fully understand what it was. The shape shifted and blurred in ways that hurt to look at, but he understood its purpose. It wanted to take over the farmhouse. It wanted to consume the family and use their home as a new anchor point in the physical world. Muriel didn't see the danger until it was too late. Eustace didn't see it at all. He just yelled at Courage for knocking over a lamp while trying to fight the thing. Courage spent that entire night running through the house, trying to contain the threat. He lured it away from Muriel, locked it in rooms, threw objects at it to slow it down. He didn't have a plan, just a desperate need to keep Muriel safe until sunrise. And somehow, through sheer persistence and a bit of luck, he managed to drive the thing back into the crate and seal it shut. By morning, the crate was gone, vanished the same way it had arrived, and Muriel woke up thinking she'd had a strange dream. Eustace blamed Courage for the mess in the house. Courage said nothing, because there was nothing to say. He had done his job, and that was enough. But it wasn't the last time a package would arrive. It wasn't the last time a stranger would knock. The farmhouse seemed to broadcast its location to every wandering monster, cursed object, and malevolent spirit in Kansas. Some threats came looking for shelter, others came looking for victims, and a few seemed to arrive purely by accident, drawn to the farmhouse like moths to a porch light. Courage couldn't stop them from coming, but he could stop them from winning. That became his role. The silent guardian of a home that refused to admit it needed guarding. Another early encounter involved a traveler who claimed their car had broken down nearby. They knocked on the door late at night, soaking wet from a sudden rainstorm, and asked if they could use the phone. Muriel, ever kind, invited them inside without a second thought. Courage knew immediately that something was off. The traveler's smile was too fixed, their eyes too still, and they moved in a way that didn't quite match normal human motion. But Eustace waved him away, called him paranoid, and told Muriel to make the traveler some tea. What followed was a tense game of cat and mouse inside the farmhouse. The traveler didn't attack right away. They waited, watched, and slowly revealed upon what they really were. Courage tried every trick he could think of to expose them, knocking over lamps to create shadows that would show the traveler's true form, spilling water to see if it would react, even pretending to be friendly so he could get close enough to investigate. And when the traveler finally dropped their disguise, revealing themselves as something monstrous and hungry, Courage was ready. He had already figured out the thing's weakness: it couldn't stand bright light, and he used every lamp, flashlight, and reflective surface in the house to drive it back out into the storm. Muriel thanked him for being such a good watchdog. Eustace grumbled that the stupid dog had wasted electricity. Courage just curled up by the door and kept his eyes on the windows because he knew the night wasn't over yet. And sure enough, an hour later, something else knocked. Courage was there to answer. The lesson became clear. Nowhere didn't play by normal rules. The farmhouse sat on a kind of boundary, a place where the normal world thinned out and the impossible could slip through. Courage didn't understand the mechanics of it. He was just a dog, but he understood the result. As long as they lived here, danger would keep coming. And as long as Muriel refused to leave, Courage would keep fighting. What made it harder was that Muriel and Eustace never fully remembered the threats. Sometimes they would wake up the next morning with vague impressions of a bad dream or a faint sense that something strange had happened, but the details would slip away like water through a sieve. Courage suspected the farmhouse itself did this somehow, resetting their memories along with the furniture and the walls. It was a mercy. In a way, it kept Muriel from being terrified all the time, kept Eustace from packing up and leaving. But it also meant Courage was always alone in his knowledge, always the only one who remembered how close they had come to disaster the night before. And so the pattern repeated. Danger knocked, Courage answered. Muriel smiled and opened the door. Eustace complained and ignored the warning signs. Something monstrous revealed itself. Courage fought back with whatever he had. The house reset. Morning came. And then, a few days later, danger knocked again. Courage started to recognize different types of threats. Some were mindless, creatures driven by hunger or instinct, easy to scare off or trap. Others were intelligent, with plans and goals, and those were the ones that terrified Courage the most because they could adapt, could think around his defenses. A few were somewhere in between: cursed objects, possessed dolls, things that had once been normal but had been twisted into something wrong. Each type required a different approach, and Courage learned to read the signs quickly: how a threat moved, how it sounded, what it seemed to want. But no matter the type, the core truth stayed the same. Courage was terrified, every single time. He didn't get braver with practice, he just got better at acting while scared. His heart still pounded, his legs still shook, his instinct was always to run and hide. But Muriel was behind him, humming softly to herself, completely unaware of the danger, and that was enough to make him move forward instead of backward. Fear first, courage second. That was the rhythm of his life now. Not every threat that came to the farmhouse arrived on two legs or crawled through the windows. Some dangers were older, deeper, tied to rules that nobody in Nowhere remembered anymore. Courage encountered his first curse during a quiet afternoon when Muriel was gardening and Eustace was napping in his chair. A package arrived at the door. Another one, because packages in Nowhere were never just packages. And this time, it contained a large stone slab covered in carved symbols. Muriel thought it was beautiful and decided to use it as a new step leading up to the porch. Courage saw the symbols glowing faintly in the sunlight and knew this was a mistake. He barked, tried to dig up the slab, even attempted to drag it away, but Eustace kicked him aside and told him to stop being stupid. The slab stayed. And that night, the farmhouse changed. The curse didn't attack directly. Instead, it rewrote the rules of the house itself. Doors would open into rooms that didn't exist. Hallways stretched longer than they should. Shadows moved independently of their owners, creeping along the walls with slow, deliberate intent. Courage could feel the wrongness pressing down on him, a heavy weight that made it hard to breathe. This wasn't a creature he could fight or scare away. This was something woven into the fabric of the house now, something that would stay until the source was destroyed. The slab's curse came with a warning, carved into the stone in an ancient language that Courage couldn't read but somehow understood anyway. It spoke of a debt, a price that had never been paid, and a punishment that would fall on whoever claimed the slab as their own. Muriel had claimed it by bringing it into her home, and now the curse considered her marked. Courage watched in horror as Muriel began to change, not physically, but in the way she moved and spoke. She became distant, distracted, as if part of her mind was being pulled somewhere else. Courage spent the next several hours racing through the twisted version of the farmhouse, trying to find the slab and destroy it. But the curse was clever. It hid the slab in shifting locations, moving it every time Courage got close. He would spot it at the end of a hallway, sprint toward it, and then find himself Back at the starting point, as if the house had looped around in itself. Time felt wrong too. Minutes stretched into hours, and hours collapsed into seconds. Courage could hear Eustace snoring in his chair somewhere, oblivious, while Muriel wandered the house like a sleepwalker, drawn toward something Courage couldn't see. Eventually, Courage figured out the pattern. The curse wanted to separate him from Muriel, to keep him distracted while it finished whatever ritual it had started. So Courage stopped chasing the slab and started following Muriel instead. He stayed close to her, nudging her away from dangerous rooms, blocking doorways that led to dead ends or worse. And slowly, as he guided her back towards Fred, the center of the house, the curse began to weaken. It needed her isolated to finish its work, and Courage wasn't letting that happen. When Courage finally found the slab again, it was sitting in the middle of the living room, glowing brighter than before. The symbols on its surface had changed, rearranged into something that looked almost like a face. Courage understood then that the slab wasn't just cursed, it was alive, or at least aware, and it was angry. But Courage didn't care. He grabbed a heavy object, Eustace's favorite hammer, left lying on the floor, and brought it down on the slab with all the strength his small body could manage. The slab cracked. The house shuddered. The shadows snapped back into place. The hallways returned to normal, and Muriel blinked awake as if she had just finished a long nap. She looked around, confused, and asked Courage if he wanted a snack. Eustace woke up, saw the broken slab, and blamed Courage for ruining a perfectly good stepping stone. Courage just stood there, panting and exhausted, staring at the shattered pieces of stone on the floor. The glow was gone. The curse was broken, but the memory stayed. This was the night Courage learned that some dangers couldn't be outrun or scared off. Curses didn't care about strength or cleverness. They followed rules that were older than anything in Nowhere, rules that demanded specific actions in specific orders. Fighting a curse meant understanding what it wanted and denying it that thing, no matter how long it took. Courage didn't have any special knowledge or magic, but he had stubbornness, and sometimes that was enough. The curse also taught Courage something else. The farmhouse itself could be turned into a weapon against them. The walls, the doors, the very layout of the rooms, all of it could be twisted and used by something with enough power. That meant Courage couldn't rely on familiar ground. He had to stay alert, had to adapt, because the house that protected them during the day could become a trap at night. Over the following weeks, more cursed objects arrived. A mirror that showed reflections of things that hadn't happened yet. A music box that played a song nobody recognized, but that made anyone who heard it forget where they were. A painting that watched the room and whispered to itself when no one was looking. Courage dealt with each one the same way. Locate the source, break the object, and drag the pieces outside where they couldn't affect the house anymore. It was exhausting, repetitive work, but it kept Muriel safe, and that was all that mattered. Eustace never helped. If anything, he made things worse by bringing home bargains from the occasional trips he took into town, old junk that he thought he could resell. Items that were cheap because nobody else wanted them, things that Courage immediately recognized as dangerous. One time, Eustace brought home an ancient record that, when played, opened a doorway to somewhere dark and cold. Another time, he bought an old lamp that granted wishes, but every wish came with a terrible cost. Courage had to fix both situations, and both times Eustace blamed him for ruining good deals. But the slab curse stayed with Courage the longest, because it was the first time he realized that Nowhere didn't just attract danger, it was built on top of danger. The land itself remembered things, old things, buried things that occasionally clawed their way back to the surface. The farmhouse sat right in the middle of it all, a beacon for anything that wanted a way back into the world. And Courage, a small pink dog who had been abandoned and then adopted, was now the only line of defense between those ancient forces and the kindest person he had ever known. Courage quickly learned to tell the difference between a one-time threat and something worse, a predator who would return. Some monsters passed through Nowhere by accident, caused chaos, and then moved on, never to be seen again. But others saw the Bagay farmhouse as a resource, a place they could exploit whenever they needed something. And two names appeared more than any others in Courage's nightmares: Cats and Laquack. Cats was the first recurring villain Courage encountered, and also the most unsettling. He was a tall, red cat who moved with the smooth confidence of someone who had never lost a fight. He ran a motel on the outskirts of Nowhere, a small, rundown building that somehow stayed in business despite having no other guests. The first time the Bagay family stopped there during a road trip, Muriel thought it looked charming. Eustace complained about the price, but paid anyway. Courage knew something was wrong the moment they stepped through the door. Katz welcomed them with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He showed them to their room, offered them dinner, and asked polite questions about their trip. But Courage noticed the details Katz tried to hide, the scratches on the walls, the stains on the carpet, the way certain rooms stayed locked. And then, late that night, Courage discovered the truth. Katz wasn't running a motel, he was running a trap. The building was full of mechanisms designed to hurt, capture, or kill anyone who stayed too long. Katz lured in travelers, waited until they were asleep, and then made them disappear. Courage spent that night dismantling traps, creating distractions, and leading Muriel away from danger without waking her. Katz noticed quickly and turned his attention toward the dog, intrigued by the small creature who kept ruining his plans. The two of them played a tense game throughout the building, Courage hiding, Katz hunting, both of them moving in silence so as not to wake the sleeping humans. Courage won by setting off one of Katz's own traps and trapping the cat in a locked room just long enough for the family to escape at sunrise. But Katz didn't forget. He showed up again months later, running a different business in a different location. This time, a spa, designed to lure people in with promises of relaxation before trapping them in something far worse. Courage recognized him immediately and tried to warn Muriel, but she was too excited about the idea of a spa date to listen. The pattern repeated. Katz smiled, set his traps, and waited. Courage dismantled, distracted, and barely escaped. And when it was over, Katz would vanish again, always one step ahead of any consequences. What made Katz so dangerous wasn't his strength, though he was strong, or his intelligence, though he was clever. It was his patience. He never rushed, never lost his temper, never made mistakes out of anger or frustration. He treated every encounter with Courage like a game, something mildly entertaining that he could afford to lose because there would always be another opportunity. And Courage hated that most of all, the way Katz saw him as a challenge instead of a threat, the way the cat kept coming back because he genuinely enjoyed the hunt. Then there was Laquack. Where Katz was calm and methodical, Laquack was loud, theatrical, and constantly shifting identities. He was a duck, or at least shaped like one who specialized in cons, thefts, and elaborate schemes that always targeted the Bagay family in some way. His first appearance came disguised as a foreign dignitary who needed a place to stay while his castle was being repaired. Muriel, ever trusting, welcomed him in and treated him like royalty. Eustace was annoyed but tolerated the guest because Laquack promised a reward. Courage saw through the disguise almost immediately. Laquack moved wrong, spoke with an accent that kept shifting, and seemed far too interested in the family's valuables for someone who claimed to be wealthy. But by the time Courage figured out the full scope of the con, Laquack had already convinced Muriel to sign over temporary ownership of the farmhouse, claiming it was part of a diplomatic agreement. Eustace, blinded by greed, didn't question it. And just like that, the family was locked out of their own home while Laquack ransacked it, looking for anything worth stealing. Courage had to break back into his own house, navigate Laquack's traps, and expose the con before the duck could escape with everything Muriel owned. It ended with Laquack fleeing into the desert, shouting threats and promises to return. And return he did. Again and again. Sometimes as a doctor, sometimes as a teacher, sometimes as a long-lost relative. Each time the disguise was different, but the goal was always the same. Exploit Muriel's kindness, take what he could, and disappear before anyone could stop him. Laquack was easier to defeat than Katz because he lacked patience. He got greedy, pushed his luck, and made mistakes when things didn't go according to plan. But he was also harder to predict because he never used the same approach twice. Courage had to learn to recognize Laquack by behavior rather than appearance. The way he talked too fast when he was lying. The way he always positioned himself near an exit. The way his eyes constantly scanned the room for valuables. These small tells saved Courage more than once. What both villains had in common was this: they saw the Bagay farmhouse as a repeatable target. They understood that Muriel would always trust a friendly face, that Eustace would always be swayed by greed, and that Courage would always be dismissed as paranoid. They exploited those patterns, refined their strategies, and kept coming back because they knew the farmhouse would always be there, isolated and vulnerable, waiting for the next knock on the door. Courage started keeping watch for them specifically. Whenever a stranger arrived with a business proposal or a sob story, Courage would check for certain signs, the the smooth, predatory walk that marked cats or the over-rehearsed speech patterns that revealed Laquack. Sometimes he caught them early and managed to chase them off before they could set their plans in motion. Other times, they slipped past his defenses and he had to fight them the hard way, through the night, one trap at a time. The recurring predators taught Courage something important. Some enemies don't go away just because you beat them once. They adapt, learn, and return stronger or smarter or more prepared. That meant Courage couldn't relax. He couldn't assume a threat was over just because the sun came up and the house reset itself. Cats and Laquack were still out there, planning their next approach, and Courage had to stay one step ahead or risk losing everything he was trying to protect. If Muriel's kindness made her an easy target, Eustace's greed made him a weapon pointed straight at his own family. Courage lost count of how many times a villain walked through the front door because Eustace had invited them in, lured by promises of money, fame, or some shortcut to an easier life. And every single time, Courage was the one who had to clean up the mess. One of the clearest examples came when a traveling salesman arrived at the farmhouse, offering Eustace a deal that sounded too good to be true, because it was. The salesman claimed to represent a company that would pay enormous sums of money for ordinary household items, things that Eustace already owned and would be happy to part with. All Eustace had to do was sign a simple contract. Courage tried to stop him, barking and pulling at his pant leg, but Eustace shoved him away and signed without reading a single word. The contract, of course, wasn't about household items. It was about the house itself, and the family inside it. The salesman revealed himself to be something far worse than human, something that fed on the energy of living spaces and the people who inhabited them. By signing, Eustace had given the creature legal ownership of the farmhouse, and it intended to drain everything, the building, the land, Muriel, Eustace, and even Courage, until nothing was left but an empty husk. Courage spent that entire night fighting not just the creature, but the contract itself. The words on the paper had power, binding the family to the agreement in ways that couldn't be broken by force alone. Courage had to find the contract, read through the dense legal language, and locate the single loophole buried in the fine print. The agreement could be voided if the salesman failed to provide the promised payment within 24 hours. Courage then had to prevent the salesman from making the payment, which involved destroying the creature's truck, scattering its goods across the desert, and leading it on a chase that lasted until dawn. When the sun came up, the contract dissolved, and the salesman vanished, furious but powerless. Eustace woke up, saw the destruction, and blamed Courage for ruining a good business opportunity. Muriel made breakfast. Courage curled up under the table, exhausted and ignored. This pattern repeated with slight variations. Eustace would see an advertisement promising wealth or meet a stranger who claimed to know a secret to success, and he would leap at the chance without thinking. Sometimes the scheme involved gambling. Other times it was a contest or a treasure map or a magical object that granted wishes. And every time, Courage had to intervene before Eustace's greed destroyed them all. One particularly bad situation involved a creature that posed as a talent scout, promising to make Eustace famous. Eustace, who had always resented his quiet, unremarkable life, jumped at the chance. The scout set up cameras, brought in equipment, and began filming what he claimed would be a documentary about the Bagay family, but Courage quickly realized the truth. The footage wasn't for entertainment, it was for something darker. The scout was recording their lives, their routines, their vulnerabilities, so that other predators would know exactly how and when to strike. Courage sabotaged the equipment, destroyed the footage, and chased the scout off the property. Eustace was furious and spent weeks complaining about his stolen chance at fame, but Courage didn't care. He had seen what would happen if that footage got out. Every monster, con artist, and curse in Nowhere would have a roadmap to the farmhouse, and the family wouldn't survive the attention. What made Eustace's greed so dangerous was that it wasn't limited to strangers. He would also endanger the family by accepting cursed objects, buying suspicious items at discount prices, or participating in schemes that required him to gamble away things he didn't actually own, like Muriel's safety or the deed to the farmhouse. Eustace never seemed to learn that the deals were always traps, that the promises were always lies, and that Courage was always right to be afraid. There were moments when Courage wondered if Eustace even cared about Muriel. The old man never defended her, never checked to make sure she was safe, never thanked Courage for protecting her. He just sat in his chair, read his newspaper, and complained about how the stupid dog was always causing problems. But Muriel loved Eustace, and Courage couldn't protect Muriel without also protecting her husband, so he did. Even when Eustace kicked him, insulted him, or actively made things worse, Courage kept stepping between the old man and danger. Not because Eustace deserved it, but because Muriel would be heartbroken if anything happened to him. Eustace's greed also attracted a specific type of villain: the smooth talker, the con artist, the schemer who understood how to manipulate people through their desires. These villains were often more dangerous than the monsters because they didn't need to break down the door. Eustace would open it for them, welcome them in, and hand over whatever they wanted without realizing what he was giving away. Courage had to learn to recognize these threats not by their appearance, but by the way they spoke, the promises they made, and the way Eustace's eyes would light up with greed whenever they mentioned money. One time, Eustace accepted a cursed violin from a mysterious musician who claimed it could play itself and earn money through street performances. The moment Eustace took the instrument, it bonded to him, forcing him to play non-stop while it slowly drained his life force. Courage had to find the musician, learn how the curse worked, and break the violin before Eustace collapsed from exhaustion. Eustace's response, once freed, anger that Courage had destroyed such a valuable item. Another time, Eustace agreed to let a stranger plant strange seeds in the farmhouse garden, promised that the plants would grow into something worth a fortune. The seeds grew into vines that tried to consume the entire property, wrapping around the house and pulling it underground. Courage spent hours cutting through the vines, dodging their grasping tendrils and burning the seeds before they could spread further. Eustace complained that Courage had ruined his crop. Through all of this, Courage developed a specific strategy for dealing with Eustace-related threats. Identify the villain's leverage, remove that leverage before Eustace could act on it, and then deal with the fallout when Eustace got angry. It was exhausting work, made worse by the fact that Eustace never acknowledged the danger he'd been in. But Courage kept doing it, night after night, because the alternative was watching Muriel lose her home, her husband, or her life to some scheme that Eustace had invited through the door. Between the scares, the fights, and the endless nights of terror, there were moments that reminded Courage why he kept fighting. Those moments always involved Muriel, her warmth, her kindness, her refusal to see the world as anything other than a place full of people who just needed a little help. These things were Courage's anchor. When the fear became too much, when he wanted to run away and never come back, he would think of Muriel's soft voice calling him a good dog, and he would find the strength to move forward. Muriel treated Courage like family, not like a pet. She spoke to him as if he could understand every word, and he could, even if he couldn't speak back. She asked his opinion on things, told him about her day, and sang to him when he seemed upset. She made him a special blanket for cold nights, cooked his favorite meals, and never once raised her voice at him, even when he accidentally made a mess. In a house where Eustace's cruelty was a constant presence, Muriel's gentleness felt like a miracle. Courage noticed the way Muriel went out of her way to make others feel safe. When a lost traveler knocked on the door, Muriel's first instinct was to offer food and shelter. When a stranger seemed upset, Muriel would sit with them and listen. When Courage was scared, Muriel would scoop him up in her arms and tell him everything would be okay. She had no idea how often she was wrong, how many of those travelers were monsters, how many of those strangers were con artists. But her belief in goodness was so strong that Courage couldn't help but protect it. There were mornings when Courage would wake up to find Muriel already in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. The sunlight would stream through the windows, the farmhouse would be quiet and peaceful, and for a few minutes, Courage could almost believe that nowhere was a normal place. Muriel would notice him watching and smile, patting the chair next to her as an invitation to join her. Those moments were rare, but they mattered more than anything else in Courage's life. Muriel also had a way of seeing past Courage's fear to the bravery underneath. Whenever Courage managed to stop a threat, Muriel would thank him, tell him he was the best dog in the world, and give him a treat or a hug. She didn't fully understand what he had protected her from. The house's reset effect made sure of that. But she understood that Courage had done something important. That acknowledgement, small as it was, kept Courage going through the worst nights. But Muriel's warmth also made her the primary target for almost every villain that came to nowhere. Monsters sensed her kindness and saw it as weakness. Curses gravitated toward her because she was pure and unguarded. Con artists exploited her trust because she genuinely believed people were telling the truth. And Courage, watching all of this happen again and again, understood that his job wasn't just to protect Muriel from danger. It was to protect her ability to stay kind in a world that kept punishing her for it. One of the hardest nights came when a creature specifically targeted Muriel's compassion. It arrived disguised as an injured animal, limping and crying at the farmhouse door. Muriel brought it inside immediately over Courage's frantic protests and began caring for it. The creature waited until Muriel was alone, then revealed its true form and tried to drain her life force, feeding on her kindness the way a parasite feeds on a host. Courage barely got there in time, throwing himself between Muriel and the creature and fighting with a desperation he had never felt before. When it was over, Muriel had no memory of the attack. She just woke up on the couch, a little tired, and asked Courage if he wanted to watch the sunset with her. Courage sat next to her, still shaking from fear and exhaustion, and realized that this was the cost of loving someone like Muriel. You had to protect not just her body, but her spirit, the part of her that believed the world was good. And that was the heaviest burden Courage had ever carried. Muriel's warmth also extended to the rare moments when she defended Courage against Eustace. If Eustace was being particularly cruel, kicking Courage out of the house, blaming him for something that wasn't his fault, or calling him useless, Muriel would step in. Her voice would stay gentle, but it would carry a firmness that even Eustace couldn't ignore. She would remind him that Courage was part of the family, that he deserved kindness, and that he was trying his best. Eustace would grumble and back down, and Courage would feel a rush of gratitude so strong it almost hurt. Those small acts of defense meant everything to Courage. They proved that Muriel didn't just tolerate him, she valued him. She saw him as more than a scared little dog who caused problems. She saw him as someone worth protecting, and that belief gave Courage the courage to keep protecting her in return. As time passed, Courage began to understand that Muriel's warmth wasn't naivety. She knew the world could be dangerous, she just chose to respond with kindness anyway. She chose to open the door when strangers knocked, to offer help when people were in need, to believe that goodness existed even when everything suggested otherwise. And Courage, who had been abandoned and left to die before Muriel found him, understood that her choice to be kind was the only reason he was alive. He owed her everything. And so, no matter how many monsters came through that door, no matter how many nights he spent fighting in the dark, he would keep making sure she could wake up each morning and keep being the person she chose to be. Courage never stopped being afraid. That was important to understand. He didn't grow braver in the traditional sense. He didn't become confident, didn't start charging into danger without hesitation, didn't lose the instinct to panic when something monstrous appeared at the door. What changed was that fear became a tool instead of a paralysis. He learned to act while terrified, to think through the panic, to turn his fear into motion instead of freezing. The shift happened gradually over dozens of encounters with different threats. Early on, Courage's responses were pure instinct: scream, run, hide, repeat. But as the dangers kept coming, Courage began to notice patterns. Certain types of monsters reacted predictably to loud noises. Certain curses could be disrupted by breaking specific objects. Certain con artists would flee if their disguise was exposed in front of witnesses. Courage couldn't overpower most of the threats he faced, but he could outthink them, outmaneuver them, and outlast them. He started building a mental toolkit. One of his most reliable strategies was the disguise. Courage discovered that many villains, especially the more intelligent ones, were susceptible to confusion if he pretended to be something he wasn't. He would throw on a costume sometimes, just a sheet, sometimes something more elaborate that he cobbled together from household items, and approach the threat from a different angle. The disguises rarely fooled anyone for long, but they didn't need to. They just needed to create a moment of hesitation, a brief window where Courage could act or escape. Another key skill was improvisation. Courage learned to use whatever was around him as a weapon or tool. A frying pan became a shield, a garden hose became a rope. A mirror could reflect light to blind an attacker or redirect a curse back at its source. The farmhouse itself, despite being a frequent target, was full of useful objects if Courage knew how to apply them. He also learned to recognize which rooms offered escape routes, which hiding spots were actually safe, and which parts of the house were structurally weak enough that he could break through in an emergency. Courage also developed a sense for timing. He learned to recognize when a threat was preparing to strike, when it was distracted, and when it was vulnerable. This sense came from paying close attention to details. the way a creature's breathing would change before it lunged, the way a curse would flicker before it activated, the way a con artist's voice would shift when they were about to reveal their true intentions. Courage couldn't always predict what would happen, but he got better at reading the signals and reacting a split second faster than he used to. One cluster of episodes from this era really highlighted Courage's growth. In each one, a strange visitor arrived with a different problem or scheme, and Courage had to adapt to wildly different situations. One night, it was a giant insect that had built a nest in the farmhouse attic. Courage dealt with it by luring the insect outside using a trail of food, then sealing the attic so it couldn't return. Another night, it was a sentient shadow that fed on fear. Courage defeated it by turning on every light in the house and forcing it into a corner where it had nowhere to hide. A third night involved a haunted object that could only be destroyed by burying it at a specific location under a full moon. Courage figured out the location by following clues hidden in the object's design, then spent hours digging in the desert to complete the task before sunrise. Each situation was different, but the approach was the same. Observe, adapt, act. Courage wasn't strong enough to fight most threats directly, so he had to find creative solutions. And the more he did this, the faster he got at recognizing what type of problem he was dealing with and which tools or strategies would work best. Another important skill Courage developed was communication, or the lack thereof. Since Courage couldn't speak, he had to find other ways to warn Muriel or get her to safety. He learned that pulling at her dress worked better than barking, that leading her by hand was more effective than trying to block her path, and that sometimes the best option was to create a distraction that would naturally move her away from danger without her realizing what was happening. Courage also learned to read Muriel's body language, so he could tell when she was about to do something risky and intervene before it was too late. But perhaps the most important skill Courage developed was endurance. Not physical endurance, though that mattered too, but mental and emotional endurance. The ability to keep going after a long night of terror, to wake up the next morning and prepare for the next threat, to survive dozens of encounters without losing hope or giving up. Courage learned to carry exhaustion, fear, and trauma without letting them stop him from acting when it mattered. He learned to accept that there would always be another monster, another curse, another con artist, and that his job was to be ready every single time. This was also the period where Courage stopped looking for help from Muriel or Eustace. Early on, he had tried to get them to understand the danger, to acknowledge what was happening, to take action alongside him. But the house's reset effect, combined with Eustace's stubbornness and Muriel's blind trust, made that impossible. So Courage stopped trying to convince them and started handling everything himself. It was a lonely shift, but it made him more effective. He no longer wasted time trying to communicate the impossible. He just moved, acted, and fixed the problem before it could escalate. The result of all this growth was subtle but undeniable. Courage became competent. Not confident, not fearless, but competent. He could assess a situation quickly, formulate a plan, execute it under pressure, and adapt when things went wrong. He still panicked, still screamed, still wanted to run away, but those feelings no longer controlled him. They were just the background noise of his life now, something he carried while doing what needed to be done. And through it all, the fear stayed. It never left. It was always there, sitting heavy in his chest, making his legs shake and his heart race. But Courage had learned to move forward anyway, one terrified step at a time, because Muriel was behind him, and that was all the reason he needed. By the end of Act 1, the pattern was locked in so deeply that it felt like the farmhouse existed in a loop. Danger would arrive, chaos would erupt, Courage would fight through the night, and then morning would come and the house would reset itself. Broken windows repaired themselves. Shattered furniture reassembled. Scorch marks vanished from the walls. And Muriel and Eustace would wake up with no memory of what had happened, ready to face another normal day in nowhere. Courage started to see the farmhouse less as a home and more as a stage, a place where the same story played out over and over with only minor variations. The setting was always the same: the flat desert, the isolated house, the endless sky. The cast rotated, different monsters, different con artists, different curses, but their roles stayed consistent. The plot repeated. Someone knocks, Muriel opens the door. Eustace ignores the warning signs. Courage fights to protect them both. The ending was always the same: The threat defeated or driven away, the house restored, and the family oblivious to how close they had come to disaster. What made this unsettling wasn't the repetition itself, but the fact that nobody learned anything from it. Muriel didn't become more cautious. Eustace didn't stop inviting danger into their lives. Even the land around nowhere didn't change. It stayed flat, empty, and full of hidden threats that could emerge at any moment. The only one who accumulated experience was Courage, and that experience was a burden he carried alone. Some nights, Courage would stand at the farmhouse window and stare out at the desert, wondering if this was all his life would ever be. Fighting, surviving, watching the sun rise, and then preparing for the next fight. There were no breaks, no vacations, no moments when he could let his guard down and trust that someone else would handle the danger. He was the farmhouse's only defense, and that role would never end as long as they stayed in nowhere. But Courage also understood, in a way he couldn't fully articulate, that the farmhouse's ability to reset itself was a kind of mercy. If the damage stayed, if the scars accumulated, if Muriel and Eustace had to live with the full weight of what happened every night, they would break. Muriel's kindness would turn to fear. Eustace's greed would turn to paranoia. The house itself would become unlivable. So the reset was necessary, even if it meant Courage had to carry all the memories alone. There were moments when Courage wondered if he was remembering things correctly. The house reset so perfectly, so completely, that sometimes he questioned whether the previous night's events had actually happened, or if he had just imagined them. But then he would see a small detail, a scratch on the wall that took an extra day to fade, a faint stain on the carpet that wasn't quite gone yet, a lingering smell of smoke or sulfur, and he would know it was real. The house tried to erase the evidence, but it wasn't perfect. The truth always left traces if you knew where to look. Courage also noticed that the threats were escalating. Early on, most of the dangers were isolated incidents. A random monster passing through, a cursed object delivered by mistake, a con artist trying their luck. But as time went on, the threats became more coordinated, more intentional. Some villains, like Cats and Laquack, started returning with refined strategies. New threats arrived with specific knowledge about the Bagay family, as if something was feeding them information. The farmhouse was becoming known, not just as a target, but as a challenge, something that predators wanted to conquer. This shift terrified Courage more than any individual monster. It suggested that nowhere wasn't just a random collection of dangers, but a place with its own ecosystem, its own rules, and its own awareness. The farmhouse sat at the center of that ecosystem, and every night it broadcast its location like a lighthouse in the dark. Courage couldn't turn off the signal, couldn't hide the house, couldn't make it less visible. All he could do was stand guard and deal with whatever came through the door. One of the hardest realizations for Courage came when he understood that he couldn't protect Muriel from every danger. Some threats slipped past his defenses, some arrived too quickly for him to react. Some were subtle enough that he didn't recognize them until it was too late. Muriel got hurt sometimes, not often, and never seriously enough to leave permanent damage thanks to Courage's intervention, but it happened. And every time it did, Courage felt like he had failed, even though logically he knew he was doing the best he could. But Muriel never blamed him. She never even knew there was anything to blame him for. She would wake up the next morning, notice that Courage seemed upset, and comfort him without understanding why he was upset in the first place. She would hold him, tell him he was a good dog, and offer him a treat. And Courage would accept the comfort, even though it didn't change the fact that he had let her get hurt, even though he knew it would probably happen again. Eustace predictably continued to make everything harder. His cruelty toward Courage didn't lessen with time. If anything, it became more casual, more routine. He would kick Courage out of the house for no reason, blame him for problems that weren't his fault, mock him when he tried to warn the family about danger. Eustace had no idea that Courage was the only reason he was still alive, and Courage had given up trying to make him understand. Protecting Eustace wasn't about earning his respect or gratitude. It was about keeping Muriel from losing the person she loved, no matter how unworthy that person seemed. By the end of this era, Courage had fully settled into his role as the silent guardian of nowhere. He didn't need recognition, didn't need thanks, didn't need anyone to understand what he was doing. He just needed Muriel to stay safe, the farmhouse to stay standing, and the next sunrise to arrive so he could rest before the next threat appeared. The battlefield reset itself every morning, but Courage's vigilance never did. He was always watching, always waiting, always ready to act the moment something knocked on the door. and knock. Things did, over and over, without end, because this was nowhere, and nowhere never learned. As seasons passed, the threats to the Bagay farmhouse stopped feeling random and started feeling personal. The monsters that had visited once began circling back, like predators who had marked the farmhouse on their mental maps as a place worth revisiting. And two names kept appearing in Courage's nightmares with increasing frequency: Cats and Laquack. These weren't mindless creatures or one-time curses. These were intelligent, patient hunters who understood that the farmhouse would always be there, isolated and vulnerable, waiting for their next scheme. Cats returned first, and this time he wasn't running a motel. He had opened a new establishment, a candy shop in a small town not far from nowhere. Muriel spotted the advertisement during one of the family's rare trips into civilization, and her eyes lit up with childlike excitement. She loved candy, loved the idea of a quaint little shop run by what appeared to be a polite, well-dressed cat. Courage recognized Cats immediately, and tried every method he knew to keep Muriel away from that shop, but she was already walking through the door, Eustace grumbling behind her about wasting money on sweets. Cats greeted them with the same smooth, unreadable smile he always wore. He remembered Courage. That much was clear from the way his eyes lingered on the small pink dog. But he said nothing about their previous encounters. Instead, he played the role of a charming shopkeeper, offering Muriel samples of his candy and complimenting her taste. The candy was real, and it was delicious, which made the trap even more insidious. Cats had learned from their last encounter that obvious danger would trigger Courage's defenses too quickly. This time, he was being subtle. Courage watched as Muriel purchased several boxes of candy, and Cats offered her a special deal: a lifetime supply of sweets delivered directly to the farmhouse, completely free, as a thank you for being such a kind customer. Muriel was delighted. Eustace was suspicious but couldn't find anything wrong with free candy. Courage knew, with absolute certainty, that this was a trap, but he didn't know what kind yet, and that terrified him. The deliveries started arriving daily. Each box of candy came with a small note from Cats, written in elegant script, thanking Muriel for her patronage. Muriel would read the notes aloud, touched by the gesture. Courage would inspect every box, searching for poison, curses, or hidden mechanisms. He found nothing. The candy was just candy. But Cats was up to something. Courage could feel it in the way the deliveries always arrived at exactly the same time each day, the way the boxes were always perfectly wrapped, the way Cats' notes grew slightly longer and more personal with each delivery. It took Courage nearly 2 weeks to figure out the plan. The candy wasn't the weapon. The notes were. Cats was using them to build trust, to establish a relationship with Muriel, to make himself a familiar presence in her daily routine. And then, once that trust was solidified, he sent a note inviting Muriel to visit him at the shop for a special surprise. Muriel, who now thought of Cats as a friend, accepted immediately. Eustace decided to stay home, and Courage, unable to stop Muriel from going, had no choice but to follow. The candy shop looked different at night. The cheerful decorations seemed sinister under dim lighting, and the air smelled too sweet, like something rotting beneath a layer of sugar. Cats was waiting for them in the back room, and when Muriel entered, the door locked behind her. Courage barely squeezed through before it sealed completely. The special surprise was a machine, something Cats had built specifically for Muriel, designed to extract something from her warmth, her kindness, her life force, and convert it into a substance that Cats could sell. He explained all of this calmly, as if describing a perfectly reasonable business venture, while Muriel stood there confused, and Courage felt his fear turn into something sharper and hotter. The fight that followed was brutal and efficient. Cats didn't waste time with speeches or threats. He activated the machine and tried to restrain Muriel while it warmed up. Courage threw himself at Cats, biting, clawing, doing everything he could to break the cat's concentration. Cats swatted him away with ease, but Courage kept coming back, kept attacking, kept forcing Cats to divide his attention. And while Cats was distracted, Courage found the machine's power source and destroyed it, causing the entire device to overload and explode. The explosion destroyed most of the shop. Cats escaped through a back exit, vanishing into the night with nothing but his smile and a promise that they would see each other again. Muriel was shaken but unharmed, and by the time they returned to the farmhouse, the reset effect had begun smoothing over her memories of what had happened. She remembered the candy, remembered Cats being polite, but the details of the machine and the danger faded into a vague sense that the trip had been strange. Courage knew Cats would return. The cat was too patient, too clever, and too amused by the challenge to give up. And sure enough, months later, another business appeared, this time a train service that offered luxury trips through the countryside. Muriel saw the advertisement and wanted to go. Courage saw Katz's name listed as the conductor and felt his stomach drop. The pattern repeated, Katz running a legitimate-seeming business, Muriel walking into it with complete trust, Courage fighting through another night to save her, and Katz escaping at the last moment, always one step ahead of consequences. Laquack proved equally persistent, though his methods were sloppier and his disguises more theatrical. He returned to the farmhouse disguised as a doctor, claiming that Muriel had won a free medical checkup as part of a community health initiative. Courage saw through the fake mustache and exaggerated accent immediately, but Muriel welcomed Dr. Quack into the house and allowed him to examine her. Laquack's plan this time involved convincing Muriel she had a rare condition that required expensive treatment he just happened to offer for a price that would drain the family's savings. Courage exposed the con by stealing Laquack's medical bag and revealing that it was filled with fake certificates, toy stethoscopes, and a list of other families the duck had scammed in nearby towns. Laquack fled, shouting threats about returning with a better plan. And he did, again and again. Sometimes as a teacher offering to tutor Eustace in a skill that would make him rich. Sometimes as a relative claiming to be Muriel's long-lost cousin. Sometimes as a government inspector with the authority to condemn the farmhouse unless certain fees were paid. Each scheme was different in the details but identical in structure. Laquack would arrive with a convincing story, exploit either Muriel's trust or Eustace's greed, and attempt to steal something valuable before disappearing. Courage defeated him every time, usually by exposing a flaw in the disguise, or creating a situation where Laquack's natural cowardice caused him to flee. But the duck never stayed gone. He would vanish for weeks or months, then reappear with a new identity and a refined approach, having learned from his previous failures. What made these recurring villains so exhausting for Courage was that they forced him to stay alert even during quiet periods. Every knock on the door could be Katz. Every stranger with a business proposal could be Laquack. Courage couldn't relax, couldn't assume that a peaceful week meant safety. The predators were always out there, planning, waiting, and eventually returning. And because Muriel and Eustace never fully remembered the previous encounters, they fell for the same tricks over and over, forcing Courage to fight the same battles with slightly different variables. Courage started keeping mental notes on each villain's patterns. Katz preferred long-term plans that built slowly over days or weeks, and he never lost his temper even when his schemes failed. That meant Courage had to stay vigilant over extended periods, watching for subtle signs of manipulation. Laquack, by contrast, worked quickly and emotionally, trying to grab what he could and escape before anyone realized what had happened. That meant Courage had to act fast, disrupting the con before Laquack could secure his prize and disappear. But the deeper truth behind both villains was this: they saw the Bagay farmhouse as a repeatable resource. They understood that the family would never move, never change their habits, never become less vulnerable. The farmhouse was a guaranteed target, and as long as it stood in the middle of nowhere, predators like Katz and Laquack would keep circling back, testing Courage's defenses, looking for the moment when he would slip up or be too slow. And Courage, carrying the weight of that knowledge, understood that his job would never be finished. He would fight these villains again and again, for as long as Muriel lived in this house. There was no final victory, no permanent solution. Just endless vigilance and the hope that he could keep winning long enough to protect the one person who had ever shown him kindness. Not every threat that came to the farmhouse was loud or violent. Some of the worst dangers were quiet, polite, and disturbingly personal. These were the threats that invaded spaces that should have been safe, that turned routine moments into nightmares, and that made Courage realize that sometimes the scariest monsters were the ones that smiled and spoke softly. One of the most unsettling encounters came when Muriel's nephew arrived for a visit. His name was Fred, and he seemed normal enough at first, a tall, quiet man with a gentle voice and a polite demeanor. Muriel was thrilled to see family, and even Eustace tolerated the visit without too much complaining. But Courage noticed something wrong, immediately. Fred's smile was too wide, too fixed. His eyes didn't blink at the right intervals. And the way he looked at Courage wasn't threatening exactly, but there was something deeply off about it, like Fred was studying him rather than simply acknowledging his presence. Fred was polite to everyone throughout the day, helping Muriel with chores, making small talk with Eustace, and occasionally reaching down to pat Courage's head. But every interaction felt staged, rehearsed, like Fred was performing the role of normal nephew rather than actually being one. Courage stayed close to Muriel, watching Fred's every move, waiting for the moment when the mask would slip. That moment came when Muriel asked Fred to give Courage a bath. It was a simple request, something Muriel often asked guests to help with when she was busy. Fred agreed with his usual politeness and led Courage into the bathroom, closing the door behind them. And then, once they were alone, Fred's demeanor changed. The smile stayed fixed on his face, but his voice dropped to a whisper and he began speaking to Courage in a sing-song rhythm that made every word sound wrong. Fred introduced himself properly then. Freaky Fred, he called himself, and explained that he had a particular habit, a compulsion he couldn't control. He liked to shave things, hair specifically. He found it calming, satisfying, almost addictive. And right now, looking at Courage's pink fur, Fred was feeling very compelled indeed. Courage tried to run, but Fred was faster and stronger and the bathroom door was locked. What followed was a surreal, deeply uncomfortable sequence where Fred chased Courage around the small room, scissors and razor in hand, speaking in that same disturbing sing-song voice about how naughty his compulsion was and how he just couldn't help himself. Courage fought back as best he could, knocking over bottles, turning on the water to create slippery surfaces, even attempting to climb out through the window. But Fred was methodical and patient, cornering Courage again and again until finally managing to restrain him long enough to begin shaving. The physical act wasn't painful, but the violation of it, being held down, being altered against his will, being unable to escape, or call for help, left Courage feeling more frightened than he had during most of his encounters with obvious monsters. When Fred finally finished and unlocked the door, Courage emerged completely shaved, shivering and humiliated. Muriel gasped and asked what had happened. Fred explained with perfect politeness that Courage had gotten very dirty during the bath and that shaving him had been necessary for proper cleaning. Muriel accepted this explanation, though she seemed concerned about how upset Courage looked. Eustace laughed and called Courage naked dog, and Fred left the next morning, thanking Muriel for her hospitality and promising to visit again sometime. The encounter with Fred taught Courage a new kind of fear. This wasn't the fear of being killed or of Muriel being hurt. This was the fear of being powerless, of having your autonomy stripped away by someone who seemed harmless, of being violated in a way that others wouldn't understand or take seriously. Fred never returned, but the memory of that bathroom stayed with Courage for a long time, a reminder that danger didn't always look like fangs and claws. Other threats in this era followed similar patterns: invasions of personal space, violations of trust, dangers that were social or psychological rather than physical. One episode involved a talking mattress that tried to convince Muriel to abandon her old bed and sleep on it instead. The mattress seemed friendly at first, offering comfort and promising better sleep. But once Muriel lay down on it, the mattress tried to absorb her, pulling her into itself while speaking soothingly about how she would be comfortable forever. Courage had to literally cut Muriel out of the mattress, tearing through its fabric while it screamed and thrashed. Another threat came in the form of a spirit that possessed household objects and used them to gaslight Muriel. The furniture would move when she wasn't looking, her belongings would disappear and reappear in strange locations, and the house itself would creak and groan in ways that made her feel unwelcome in her own home. Courage could see the spirit, a translucent figure that grinned as it tormented Muriel, but Muriel couldn't, and she started to believe she was losing her mind. Courage had to find a way to make the spirit visible, eventually tricking it into manifesting in a mirror so Muriel could see it and understand that she wasn't imagining things. These intimate horrors were harder for Courage to fight because they required him to protect not just Muriel's physical safety, but her mental and emotional well-being. He had to stop threats before they could manipulate her, gaslight her, or violate her sense of security. And because these threats were often subtle, working slowly over hours or days, Courage had to maintain constant vigilance without appearing paranoid or aggressive, because that would upset Muriel and make her less likely to trust him when he tried to warn her. The intimate threats also forced Courage to confront his own vulnerabilities. He couldn't always prevent these violations. Sometimes they happened too quickly or were too subtle for him to recognize until damage had already been done. And unlike physical injuries, which the house's reset effect could heal, psychological wounds lingered. Courage found himself becoming more anxious, more suspicious of friendly faces, more exhausted by the constant need to evaluate whether a kind gesture was genuine or a trap. But through all of this, Courage kept acting. When a threat invaded the bathroom, he fought in the bathroom. When a threat targeted Muriel's sense of reality, he found ways to ground her and prove the danger was real. When a threat tried to isolate him from Muriel, he refused to be separated. The intimate horrors couldn't be punched or scared away, but they could be exposed, resisted, and outlasted. And Courage, despite his fear and exhaustion, proved again and again that he could survive them. Now it brought a subtle but significant shift in Courage's role. Until now, almost every threat had targeted the Bagay family directly, and Courage's protective instincts had been focused entirely on Muriel and, by extension, Eustace. But as the dangers in Nowhere continued to escalate, Courage began encountering situations where other people, strangers, travelers, even other victims of the same monsters needed help. And despite his fear, despite how much easier it would have been to focus only on his own family, Courage found himself stepping in to protect these strangers too. The shift started small. During one of the family's road trips, they stopped at a gas station where a young traveler was being harassed by a creature disguised as a mechanic. The creature was trying to lure the traveler into the back room, promising to fix their car for free while clearly planning something far worse. Courage noticed the situation, saw the fear in the traveler's eyes, and recognized the same predatory pattern he had seen dozens of times before. He could have stayed in the truck with Muriel and Eustace, could have let the stranger deal with their own problem, but he didn't. Instead, Courage slipped out of the truck and created a distraction, knocking over oil cans and making enough noise to draw the mechanic's attention away from the traveler. The traveler used the opportunity to run, and the mechanic, realizing the situation had been exposed, fled before anyone could call for help. The traveler never knew it was Courage who had saved them. Muriel and Eustace never knew Courage had left the truck, but Courage knew, and that changed something inside him. He realized his protective instincts weren't limited to Muriel. They extended to anyone he saw being targeted by the same kinds of monsters that haunted Nowhere. Another incident involved a child who had gotten lost in the desert near the farmhouse. The child had been wandering for hours, following strange lights that turned out to be lures set by a predatory spirit. The spirit fed on fear and confusion, drawing lost travelers deeper into the desert until they collapsed from exhaustion. Courage spotted the child from the farmhouse window late one night and immediately understood what was happening. He ran out into the desert, found the child, and began leading them back to safety while the spirit tried to interfere, creating illusions and false paths to confuse them both. Courage managed to get the child close enough to the farmhouse that Muriel noticed them and came outside. The spirit, unable to operate near the house's lights, retreated into the darkness. Muriel brought the child inside, gave them food and water, and called their parents. The child kept trying to tell Muriel that a pink dog had saved them, but by the time the parents arrived to pick up their child, Courage had already retreated to his usual spot by the door, and nobody quite believed the story. The child's parents thanked Muriel for her kindness and left. Eustace complained about having been woken up, and Courage curled up under the table, exhausted but satisfied that the child was safe. These acts of extended protection became more frequent as the story progressed. Courage would notice a stranded motorist being stalked by a creature, or a hitchhiker being led into a trap, or another animal being hunted by something monstrous. And each time, despite having no obligation to help, despite the risk to himself, despite how much easier it would be to stay inside and protect only Muriel, Courage would act. He would create distractions, lead victims to safety, or fight off threats just long enough for the stranger to escape. What made this significant was that it revealed something important about Courage's character. He wasn't brave only for Muriel. He wasn't protecting people because he had been trained to do so, or because he expected recognition. He was brave because somewhere deep inside his frightened, anxious mind, he had developed a genuine moral compass. He understood what it felt like to be abandoned, to be alone and scared with nobody coming to help, and he refused to let that happen to others if he could prevent it. There was one particularly important episode during this period that tested Courage's extended empathy. A stranger arrived at the farmhouse, injured and terrified, claiming to be running from someone dangerous. The stranger wore a mask and wouldn't explain who they were or what they were running from, but their fear was genuine, and Muriel, as always, wanted to help. Eustace was suspicious and wanted to turn the stranger away, and Courage, torn between his protective instincts for Muriel and his developing sense that this stranger genuinely needed help, had to make a choice. The stranger's pursuer arrived soon after, a large, violent figure who claimed the masked stranger was a criminal and demanded they be handed over. The pursuer had all the appearances of authority, carrying weapons and speaking with confidence. But Courage noticed small details, the way the pursuer's eyes never quite focused on anything, the way they moved with too much aggression for a simple arrest, the way the stranger flinched with genuine terror when the pursuer got close. Courage made his decision. He stood between the stranger and their pursuer, refusing to let the pursuer enter the farmhouse. What followed was a tense standoff that lasted through the night. The pursuer tried multiple tactics to get past Courage: threats, bribes, attempts to sneak around, but Courage blocked every approach. Meanwhile, inside the house, the stranger slowly opened up to Muriel, explaining that they were running from an abusive situation and that the pursuer was someone who wanted to hurt them. The mask the stranger wore wasn't a disguise, it was protection, something that helped them feel safe after trauma. By morning, the pursuer had given up and left. The stranger stayed for another day, recovering under Muriel's care, and then departed with sincere thanks and a promise to find somewhere safe. Courage never learned the full story of who the stranger was or where they went after leaving, but he knew he had made the right choice, and that choice had saved someone's life. These extended acts of protection didn't replace Courage's primary mission of keeping Muriel safe. They existed alongside it, adding new layers to Courage's already exhausting role as Nowhere's defender, but they also gave Courage something he hadn't realized he needed: a sense of purpose beyond fear-driven reaction. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was actively choosing to help, to protect, to stand between danger and innocent people even when nobody asked him to and nobody would thank him for it. This shift mattered because it meant Courage was no longer just a scared dog doing whatever it took to keep his owner alive. He was becoming something more deliberate, more conscious, more heroic in the truest sense of the word. The fear was still there, always would be, but it was accompanied now by something stronger: the knowledge that he could make a difference, that his actions mattered, and that even in a place as cursed as Nowhere, small acts of bravery could save lives. The stranger with the mask had a name, though Courage never learned it. What he did learn over the course of that crucial encounter was that not every fight ended with a villain defeated or a curse broken. Sometimes the victory was simply giving someone a safe place to rest, a moment to breathe, and the courage to keep running towards something better. And sometimes that was enough. The night the masked stranger arrived, the air around the farmhouse felt different, heavier, charged with something Courage couldn't quite identify. The knock on the door came late, well past the hour when anyone normal would visit. Muriel answered it anyway because she always did, and found the stranger collapsed on the doorstep, breathing hard and clutching their side as if injured. The stranger wore a simple white mask that covered most of their face, with only their eyes visible through the openings. Those eyes were wide with fear, darting back and forth as if expecting an attack at any moment. Muriel brought the stranger inside immediately over Eustace's protests. She settled them on the couch, brought water and bandages, and began asking gentle questions about what had happened. The stranger didn't answer at first, just sat there trembling and holding the mask in place as if afraid it might slip. Courage watched from across the room, trying to assess whether this person was genuinely in trouble or if this was another trap. The fear seemed real, but Courage had been fooled before by excellent actors. Then the pursuer arrived. The pounding on the door was aggressive, demanding, nothing like the stranger's weak knock. A voice called out, claiming to be looking for someone dangerous, someone who had committed crimes and needed to be apprehended. The voice had authority in it, confidence, the kind of tone that made people want to comply. Eustace opened the door without thinking, and the pursuer pushed inside. A tall figure wearing dark clothes and carrying weapons that looked official enough to be legal but wrong enough to make Courage's instincts scream danger. The pursuer's eyes locked onto the masked stranger immediately. They demanded that Muriel hand the stranger over, claiming they had the right to take them by force if necessary. Muriel, caught between her desire to help and her confusion about the situation, looked to the stranger for guidance. The stranger shrank back, terror evident in every line of their body language, and that was when Courage made his decision. He positioned himself between the pursuer and the stranger, small body tense, ready to fight if necessary. The pursuer laughed at first, dismissing Courage as irrelevant, but Courage didn't move, and when the pursuer tried to step around him, Courage blocked the path. When the pursuer tried again, Courage growled, something he rarely did because he didn't like the sound of his own aggression, and the pursuer paused. This wasn't going to be as easy as they had expected. Muriel, sensing the tension, asked everyone to calm down and explain what was happening. The pursuer tried to maintain their authoritative tone, but Courage noticed cracks forming in the performance. The story didn't quite hold together, and the longer the pursuer talked, the more their anger showed through. The stranger from behind Courage finally spoke. Their voice was quiet but steady, and they explained that the pursuer was lying. They weren't a criminal. They were running from someone who had hurt them, someone who wanted to drag them back into a situation where they weren't safe. The mask they wore was a gift from someone who had tried to help them escape, a symbol of protection and a way to hide their face from their abuser. And the pursuer, they said, was connected to that abuser, sent to retrieve them no matter what lies had to be told. The pursuer's facade crumbled completely then. They stopped trying to sound official and started making threats, saying that the stranger belonged to someone powerful, that there would be consequences for interfering, that the Bag family had no idea what they were getting involved in. Eustace predictably wanted nothing to do with the situation and suggested they just hand the stranger over to avoid trouble. But Muriel, despite her usual trust in authority figures, looked at the stranger's terrified eyes and made a different choice. She told the pursuer to leave. The pursuer didn't leave willingly. They tried intimidation, tried to physically push past Courage, even tried to threaten Muriel directly, but Courage held his ground, and every time the pursuer got too close, he would lunge and force them back. The standoff lasted hours, with the pursuer circling the farmhouse and trying different entrances while Courage moved to block each attempt. At some point during the night, the stranger quietly thanked Courage, told him they were sorry for bringing danger to this house, and offered to leave if it would make things safer for the family. Courage looked at the stranger, at their shaking hands and exhausted posture, and thought about his own past. He remembered being alone, scared, and abandoned before Muriel found him. He remembered how much that one act of kindness had meant, how it had saved his life and given him a reason to keep going, and he decided, with absolute clarity, that he wasn't going to let this person face their terror alone. If protecting them meant staying up all night, fighting off a persistent threat, and risking his own safety, then that was what he would do. By dawn, the pursuer finally gave up. Maybe they decided the stranger wasn't worth this much effort. Maybe they were worried that the sun would make them too visible, too easy to identify. Or maybe they just recognized that Courage wasn't going to break, that the small pink dog would fight them until one of them collapsed, and they didn't want to risk that fight. Whatever the reason, they left, disappearing into the desert with final threats about how this wasn't over. The stranger stayed at the farmhouse for 2 more days. During that time, they slowly opened up to Muriel, sharing fragments of their story. They had been trapped in a situation where someone powerful controlled every aspect of their life, where leaving meant risking everything, where even their identity had been threatened. The mask was more than just physical protection. It was a way of reclaiming control, of deciding who they showed themselves to and when. Muriel listened without judgment, offered comfort without prying, and gave the stranger space to heal in whatever way they needed. Courage watched over them both, staying alert in case the pursuer returned. He noticed small details during those days, the way the stranger flinched at sudden noises, the way they kept checking the windows as if expecting an attack, the way they slowly relaxed as the hours passed without incident. On the second day, the stranger removed their mask while eating, just for a moment, and Courage saw their face clearly. They looked young, worn down by fear, but not broken by it, and when they noticed Courage watching, they smiled, small and fragile but genuine, and mouthed a silent "thank you." When the stranger finally left, they were stronger than when they had arrived. Still scared, still carrying trauma, but no longer running blind. Muriel gave them supplies for the road, a warm embrace, and directions to a town where they might find additional help. The stranger promised to stay safe, to keep moving towards something better, and to remember the kindness they had been shown, They patted Courage's head one last time, adjusted their mask, and walked into the desert toward an uncertain future. Courage never saw them again. He never learned if they reached safety, if the pursuer eventually caught up to them, or if they managed to build a new life away from whoever had hurt them. But he knew with absolute certainty that he had made the right choice. Protecting the stranger hadn't been about defeating a villain or breaking a curse. It had been about giving someone a chance, standing between them and danger long enough for them to catch their breath and find the strength to keep going. And in that moment, Courage understood that his bravery wasn't just reactive anymore. It was a choice he could make again and again, regardless of whether anyone thanked him for it. This encounter changed how Courage saw his role. He was still terrified most of the time, still operating from a place of fear rather than confidence. But fear didn't mean he couldn't choose to help. It didn't mean he couldn't stand his ground when someone needed protection. The mask that the stranger wore became a symbol in Courage's mind. Protection wasn't about being fearless, it was about covering your vulnerabilities and moving forward anyway. And that was something Courage had been doing all along, even if he hadn't realized it until now. As the story continued, the supernatural threats coming to Nowhere began pushing past the boundaries of what Courage considered possible, and in a place like Nowhere where giant insects and curses were routine, that was saying something. The farmhouse had always been a target for strange occurrences, but now reality itself seemed to be bending around it, as if the line between what was real and what was impossible had worn so thin that anything could slip through. One of the first signs came when the farmhouse's television started showing programs that didn't exist. At first, it seemed like a simple technical glitch, strange static, channels that flickered in and out. But then the programs became interactive, reaching out from the screen and pulling viewers into the broadcast. Courage watched in horror as Eustace, sitting in his usual chair and complaining about nothing good being on, was suddenly yanked into the television screen and trapped inside a strange game show where failure meant being erased from existence entirely. Courage had to follow Eustace into the television, diving through the screen and emerging inside a surreal landscape where the rules of physics didn't apply. Gravity shifted randomly, distances stretched and compressed without warning, and the game show host, a grinning entity that seemed to be made of television static, controlled everything with arbitrary whims. The challenges were nonsensical, answer questions that had no right answers, complete tasks that changed their requirements mid-attempt, navigate mazes that reconfigured themselves to prevent escape. Courage had to drag Eustace through each challenge, solving impossible puzzles through trial and error and sheer persistence, until finally finding the exit that led back to the real world. When they emerged, Eustace had no memory of the experience. The television was off, and he simply assumed he had dozed off in his chair. Courage, on the other hand, carried the memory of that impossible place, that world where reality was just a suggestion and suffering was entertainment. The television remained in the house, and Courage watched it warily from then on, waiting for it to activate again. Another break from normal reality came when strange machines started appearing around Nowhere, devices that seemed to have been built by some unknown intelligence for purposes that made no sense. One such machine materialized in the farmhouse basement overnight, a massive, humming contraption covered in blinking lights and spinning gears. Courage discovered it while investigating strange sounds, and before he could figure out what it did, the machine activated. Reality around the farmhouse began to loop, causing the same day to repeat over and over with slight variations each time. Courage was the only one who noticed the loops. Muriel and Eustace lived through the same day repeatedly, saying the same words, making the same choices, completely unaware that time had become a circle. Courage experienced each loop fully, remembering every iteration, watching helplessly as the same threats appeared and the same conversations happened. He tried to break the loop by destroying the machine, but every time he succeeded, the day would reset and the machine would reappear intact in the basement. It took Courage 7 loops to figure out the pattern. The machine wasn't causing the repetition, it was recording it, documenting the loops for some observer Courage couldn't see. The real source was something else, something buried deeper beneath the farmhouse. Courage spent the 8th loop digging in the basement, tearing through the floor until he found an ancient mechanism hidden in the earth, older than the house itself. He destroyed it, and time snapped back into motion, the loop broken. The machine in the basement vanished as if it had never existed. Muriel and Eustace experienced the day only once, oblivious to the fact that Courage had lived through it 9 times. The reality-bending threats continued. One night, the entire farmhouse lifted off the ground and began floating through space, pulled into orbit around a strange celestial body that sang to itself in frequencies that made Courage's head hurt. Another night, all the mirrors in the house became portals to alternate versions of the farmhouse, each one slightly wrong in disturbing ways. A version where Muriel was cruel, a version where Eustace was kind, a version where Courage had never been adopted. Courage had to prevent the family from walking through the wrong mirrors and getting trapped in realities that weren't their own. There was an encounter with a being that existed outside of time, appearing in multiple places simultaneously and speaking in overlapping voices that described events that hadn't happened yet. The being claimed to be observing the farmhouse for research purposes, studying why this particular location attracted so much supernatural activity. Courage couldn't communicate with it directly, but he managed to make it leave by creating enough chaos that its observations became useless, forcing it to move to a different location. Another threat involved the farmhouse becoming unmoored from its physical location, existing simultaneously in multiple places at once. Courage would open the front door and find himself staring at different landscapes each time. Sometimes the familiar desert, sometimes an ocean, sometimes a forest, sometimes complete void. The family remained inside, unaware that the house was sliding between locations, while Courage tried to anchor them back to nowhere by finding the one true door among dozens of false ones. These reality-bending episodes were the hardest for Courage to handle because they couldn't be solved through normal means. He couldn't fight something that didn't have a physical form. He couldn't break something that existed outside of conventional space. He couldn't even trust his own senses, because the environment itself was lying to him, showing him things that weren't there, or hiding things that were. All he could do was hold on to the one constant that never changed: Muriel. As long as he could see her, hear her, and protect her, he had an anchor point that reality couldn't take away. These experiences taught Courage that nowhere was stranger than he had ever imagined. The farmhouse wasn't just attracting supernatural threats. It was attracting phenomena that defied explanation, things that existed at the edge of possible and impossible. The world had rules, but those rules were flexible in nowhere, and the farmhouse sat at the center of that flexibility like a lighthouse in a storm of broken physics. What kept Courage sane through these encounters was his focus. He didn't try to understand why the television pulled people inside, or why time looped, or why reality bent. He just focused on the immediate goal: get Muriel to safety, get Eustace back, restore normal, move on. Understanding could come later, if ever. Right now, survival was enough. And somehow, through sheer determination and the kind of stubborn persistence that came from having no other choice, Courage kept navigating these impossible situations and bringing his family back to something resembling normal. The reality-bending threats never fully stopped, but they became another part of the rhythm of nowhere, another category of danger that Courage had to prepare for, like curses or con artists or recurring villains. The world stopped following rules, so Courage stopped expecting it to. He just kept moving forward, one impossible day at a time, because that was all he could do. By the end of, Courage had been protecting the Baghi family for what felt like a lifetime, though in reality it had only been a few years. The threats kept coming with relentless consistency, sometimes daily, sometimes weekly, but always returning in some form. Cats would reappear with a new business scheme, Laquack would adopt a new disguise, curses would arrive in mysterious packages, reality would bend in disturbing ways. And through it all, Courage remained vigilant, fighting battles that nobody else remembered and carrying burdens that nobody else acknowledged. The farmhouse itself had become something of a legend in the supernatural community, or so it seemed from the variety of threats that sought it out. Courage started to recognize patterns in how different types of entities approached the property. Mindless creatures came direct and aggressive. Intelligent villains approached with schemes and manipulation. Cursed objects arrived through mail or trades. Reality bending. Phenomena simply manifested without warning. Each category required different responses, and Courage had become expert at quickly identifying which type of threat he was facing and adapting his tactics accordingly. There were still nights when Courage felt overwhelmed, when the weight of constant vigilance became too much and he wanted nothing more than to run away and hide. But those feelings always faded when he looked at Muriel, saw her sleeping peacefully because she didn't know how close danger had come, and remembered why he fought so hard. She had saved him once, found him abandoned, and given him a home. Everything he did now was repayment for that initial act of kindness, a debt he would spend the rest of his life repaying not because he had to, but because he wanted to. During this period, we'll speed run through a series of classic nowhere episodes that reinforce the established patterns. There was the night a giant hamster escaped from a science experiment and terrorized the farmhouse until Courage lured it away with food. There was the time a sentient computer virus infected every electronic device in the house and tried to take over by controlling appliances as weapons. There was an encounter with a creature made entirely of shadow that could only be defeated by luring it into direct sunlight. There was a situation where Eustace accidentally summoned something ancient by reading from a book he found in the attic, forcing Courage to reverse the summoning through trial and error. Each of these threats followed the familiar rhythm. Danger appears, Courage identifies it. Muriel and Eustace remain oblivious or dismissive. Courage fights alone, the threat is defeated or driven away, the house resets, morning comes. The details changed, but the structure stayed constant, and Courage had become so practiced at navigating this structure that his responses were almost automatic. See the threat, assess its nature, formulate a plan, execute while terrified, survive until dawn. What had changed wasn't Courage's fear or his methods, but his acceptance of the role. He no longer questioned why this was his responsibility or whether someone else should be handling it. He understood with complete clarity that he was the only one who could do this work. Muriel was too trusting, Eustace was too selfish, and there was nobody else in Nowhere who even acknowledged that supernatural threats existed. The farmhouse needed a protector, and Courage was that protector, not because he was the best choice, but because he was the only choice. This acceptance brought a strange kind of peace, even amid the constant terror. Courage stopped wasting energy on resentment or confusion about his situation. He just focused on the immediate tasks: keep Muriel safe, keep Eustace alive, keep the farmhouse standing, survive another night. The goals were simple, and their simplicity made them achievable. He couldn't control what threats would arrive or when, but he could control his response to them, and that small sphere of control was enough to keep him moving forward. There were also small victories that Courage learned to appreciate. Nights when he defeated a threat so quickly that Muriel and Eustace slept through the entire encounter. Mornings when the house reset so completely that there was no evidence anything had happened. Moments when Muriel would smile at him and call him a good dog without knowing what he had done to earn that praise. These tiny acknowledgments didn't change Courage's situation, but they reminded him that his work mattered, even if nobody fully understood it. The relationship between Courage and Eustace remained difficult, but Courage had learned to navigate it with a kind of resigned patience. Eustace would never be grateful, would never acknowledge Courage's efforts, would never stop calling him stupid or kicking him out of the house. But Courage had stopped expecting anything different. He protected Eustace not for Eustace's sake, but for Muriel's, because she loved her husband and would be devastated if anything happened to him. That was reason enough. As the story drew toward its close, there was a sense of accumulation rather than escalation. The threats weren't necessarily getting more dangerous, they were just becoming more frequent, more varied, more persistent. Nowhere was attracting attention from a wider range of supernatural entities, and the farmhouse was becoming known as a place where strange things happened, and where a small pink dog somehow kept defeating threats that should have overwhelmed him. Some villains started seeking out the farmhouse specifically because they had heard stories about Courage and wanted to test themselves against him. This growing reputation was both a blessing and a curse. It meant that smarter villains approached with more caution, which sometimes gave Courage more time to prepare. But it also meant that the challenges were becoming more sophisticated, more specifically designed to counter Courage's known tactics. Villains who had heard about Courage's tendency to use disguises would see through them faster. Threats that knew Courage relied on improvisation would try to control or remove potential weapons from his environment. The arms race between Courage and the supernatural world was slowly escalating, and Courage had to keep adapting to stay ahead. But through all of this, one thing remained constant: Courage's core motivation. He wasn't fighting for glory, wasn't protecting the farmhouse because he thought he was heroic, wasn't enduring constant terror because he enjoyed it. He was doing all of this because a kind woman had found him when he had nothing had given him a home when nobody else would, and had loved him unconditionally even though he was just a scared little dog. Everything Courage did, every night he stayed awake on guard duty, every monster he faced despite wanting to run away, all of it came back to that simple fact. Muriel had saved him once. Now he would spend the rest of his life saving her back, one terrified act of courage at a time. And as the timeline moved toward, the world outside Nowhere continued to change and evolve, but the farmhouse remained the same. Isolated, cursed, full of kindness and danger in equal measure, protected by a small pink dog who would never stop being afraid, but would also never stop fighting. Because that was what love looked like in Nowhere. Not grand gestures or fearless heroism, but showing up every single night, trembling with terror, and doing what needed to be done anyway. In another era of Nowhere, the scares kept coming, but the tone shifted in ways that were hard to define. The threats didn't necessarily become more frequent or more dangerous, they became more exhausting. Courage had been fighting for so long now that the constant vigilance had worn grooves into his psyche, patterns of behavior so automatic that he sometimes moved through entire encounters on pure reflex, his conscious mind barely engaged until the danger had passed. The scale of some threats did increase during this period, as if the supernatural world had decided that conventional monsters weren't enough anymore. One night, a massive creature emerged from beneath the desert, something so large that the farmhouse looked like a toy next to it. The creature had been sleeping underground for centuries, and something, Courage never learned what, had woken it up. It rose from the earth in a shower of sand and stone, its body stretching toward the sky, and it moved toward the farmhouse with slow, inevitable steps that shook the ground with each impact. Courage couldn't fight something that size directly. He couldn't bite it, couldn't knock it over, couldn't even reach its vulnerable points if it had any. What he could do was what he had always done: observe, adapt, improvise. He noticed that the creature reacted to sound, flinching away from loud noises even though it could have crushed the farmhouse with one step. So Courage gathered every noise-making device he could find: bells, pots, pans, the radio, even Eustace's tuba that had been gathering dust in the attic, and created a cacophony that drove the creature back underground, where it settled back into sleep. Muriel woke up the next morning wondering why all the cookware was scattered across the yard. Eustace blamed Courage for the mess. Courage just sat by the door, exhausted and watching the desert for signs that the creature might rise again. It didn't, but the encounter reinforced something. Courage had learned long ago. Size didn't matter. Every threat, no matter how overwhelming it seemed, had a weakness. His job was to find that weakness and exploit it before Muriel got hurt. Another massive threat came in the form of an entity that claimed to be collecting specimens for some cosmic zoo or museum. It arrived in a ship that defied conventional physics, hovering above the farmhouse and sending down mechanical arms to grab whatever it deemed interesting. The entity took Eustace first, plucking him out of his chair and pulling him up into the ship. Then it came back for Muriel, who was too confused to understand what was happening. And then it tried to take Courage, who fought back with everything he had. Courage managed to grab onto one of the mechanical arms as it retracted, riding it up into the ship rather than being left behind. Inside, he found a massive collection of creatures and people from across the world, all trapped in containment fields and displayed like artifacts. Eustace was there, frozen in place and unable to move. Muriel was there too, suspended in some kind of energy field that kept her docile and unaware. And Courage, small and unnoticed among the chaos of the ship's interior, began systematically destroying the containment systems. The entity discovered what Courage was doing and tried to stop him, deploying security measures and automated defenses. But Courage had learned how to navigate hostile environments through years of experience, and the ship was just another puzzle to solve. He freed the other captives, who immediately began rioting and creating chaos throughout the ship. He destroyed the power core that kept the entity's collection systems running. And when the ship began to fail and fall from the sky, Courage grabbed Muriel and Eustace and jumped. Using improvised parachutes made from the ship's fabric to slow their descent back to the farmhouse, the entity escaped before the ship crashed, taking its damaged vessel and fleeing to some other part of the universe. The freed captives scattered across Nowhere, most of them just grateful to be alive and willing to find their own way home. And the Bage family landed in their yard, with Muriel thinking they had all shared a very strange dream and Eustace complaining about having been woken up from his nap. Courage watched the stars that night, wondering if the entity would return, but knowing that even if it did, he would fight it again the same way. The scale didn't matter. The mission stayed the same. Protect Muriel, survive the night, face whatever came next. These larger threats appeared intermittently throughout this era, mixed in with more conventional dangers. There was a night when the moon itself seemed to crack open, releasing creatures that fed on shadows. There was an encounter with a being that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, trying to pull the farmhouse into a reality where it would be trapped forever. There was a situation where the desert around nowhere began expanding at an impossible rate, threatening to consume everything in its path until Courage found the source, a cursed hourglass buried beneath the sand, and destroyed it. But regardless of scale, Courage's approach remained consistent. He observed the threat to understand its nature. He identified its weakness or the mechanism that gave it power. He improvised a solution using whatever resources were available. He executed that solution while terrified and often injured. And he survived until morning, when the house would reset and the family would wake up oblivious to how close they had come to being destroyed, displaced, or consumed. What had changed wasn't Courage's capability, but his exhaustion. He was so tired now, a deep weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. Every fight took something from him, and the brief moments of peace between threats weren't enough to restore what he had lost. He carried the weight of countless encounters, hundreds of nights spent in terror, years of protecting people who would never fully understand what he had done for them. And yet he kept going, because stopping wasn't an option. Muriel needed him, the farmhouse needed him, and Courage had long ago accepted that this was his life, for better or worse, until the day he couldn't fight anymore. The bigger threats proved that Courage's mission wasn't about matching the enemy's power level. He would never be stronger than the giant creature beneath the desert, or more advanced than the cosmic collector, or more reality-defining than the dimensional beings. His strength came from something else: persistence, cleverness, and an absolute refusal to let Muriel be taken from him. Those qualities had carried him through every encounter so far, and they would carry him through whatever came next, no matter how impossible the odds seemed. As Courage continued his endless watch over the farmhouse, he began to notice patterns that suggested something deeper about Nowhere itself. The threats weren't completely random, there was a structure to them, a sense that the land itself was contributing to the danger. Some nights, while standing guard and watching the desert, Courage would see lights moving in the distance, hear sounds that didn't match any creature he recognized, feel vibrations in the ground that suggested something massive moving beneath the surface. The farmhouse, he realized, wasn't just attracting danger by chance. It was sitting on top of something old and wrong, something that had been there long before the Baggy family built their home, possibly long before humans had come to this part of Kansas at all. Nowhere wasn't empty by accident. It was empty because nothing could safely live here for long. The land remembered things, old things, and those memories occasionally clawed their way back into the present. One of the clearest examples of this came when Courage discovered ancient markings carved into the foundation stones beneath the farmhouse. He had been chasing a creature through the basement and noticed that certain stones glowed faintly when the creature passed near them. After the creature was dealt with, Courage investigated further and found symbols that predated any human language he had seen in Muriel's books. The symbols formed patterns that looked like warnings or boundaries, as if someone long ago had tried to contain something dangerous and had built markers to remind future generations not to dig deeper. Courage couldn't read the symbols, but he understood their purpose instinctively. They were saying, something is buried here, something that should stay buried, and this ground is cursed because of it. The farmhouse had been built directly on top of these warnings, either because whoever constructed it hadn't seen the markings or hadn't believed they meant anything. And now, decades later, the Bagay family was paying the price for that oversight, living on cursed ground that attracted supernatural attention like a wound attracts infection. Another night brought an encounter with what Courage could only describe as spirits of the land itself, entities that had no physical form but could manifest through the environment. They appeared as faces in the dust storms, voices in the wind, shapes made from tumbleweeds and sand that moved with unsettling purpose. These spirits didn't seem to want anything specific from the Bagay family. They were simply present, acknowledging the farmhouse's existence and occasionally testing its boundaries to see if the current occupants were strong enough to remain. Courage learned to recognize these spirits and to understand their strange rules. They couldn't enter the farmhouse directly, but could influence the area around it, making the desert more hostile, bringing storms at inconvenient times, or attracting other threats by amplifying the supernatural signal the farmhouse broadcast. They weren't malicious exactly, but they weren't friendly either. They were ancient, territorial, and they saw the farmhouse as an intrusion into their domain. The only reason they tolerated it at all was because Courage kept proving that he could defend the space, that he was strong enough to earn the right to stay. There was a particularly dangerous encounter when something broke free from beneath the farmhouse, not a creature, but a curse that had been sealed underground, possibly for centuries. The seal had been weakening over time, worn down by the constant supernatural activity in the area, and it finally failed during a night when multiple threats converged on the property simultaneously. The curse emerged as a wave of dark energy that spread across the desert, corrupting everything it touched and turning the land itself hostile. Courage watched in horror as the sand turned black, as the few struggling plants in the area withered and died, as the air became thick with a presence that made it hard to breathe. The curse was spreading, and if it wasn't stopped, it would consume not just the farmhouse, but potentially the entire region. Muriel and Eustace were already affected, moving sluggishly and speaking in monotone voices as the curse began to drain their life force. Courage had to find the curse's source and reseal it, but he had no idea how. He spent hours digging through the basement, following the trail of dark energy back to its origin point until he found a chamber beneath the foundation that he had never known existed. Inside was an altar covered in the same ancient symbols he had seen before, and at the center of the altar was a broken seal, its fragments scattered and powerless. Repairing the seal required Courage to do something he had never done before: perform a ritual. The symbols on the altar provided instructions, and though Courage couldn't read them, in any conventional sense he understood them through pure intuition, the same way he had learned to understand so many supernatural phenomena through exposure. He gathered the fragments of the seal, arranged them in the correct pattern, and used his own blood, drawn from scratches he had sustained during the night's battles, to bind the pieces together. The ritual worked, the seal reformed, the dark energy was pulled back underground, and the curse was contained once more. The desert returned to its normal hostile state, which was actually an improvement over being actively cursed. Muriel and Eustace recovered, with no memory of having been affected, and Courage collapsed in the hidden chamber, exhausted and injured, knowing that he had just prevented something catastrophic but having no one to acknowledge it. When he finally dragged himself back upstairs, Muriel found him and was concerned by how hurt he looked. She cleaned his wounds, gave him extra food, and let him sleep in her lap while she watched television. She didn't know what he had done, didn't understand that he had just saved not only her life, but potentially the lives of everyone within miles of nowhere. But her gentle care and concern were enough. Courage didn't need recognition from the world. He just needed Muriel to keep being Muriel, to keep offering kindness in a place that offered so little of it. The encounter with the ancient curse taught Courage that Nowhere's dangers weren't just random, supernatural threats passing through. They were rooted in the land's history, in choices and conflicts that had happened long before anyone currently alive had been born. The farmhouse sat at the center of this cursed geography, and as long as it remained standing, it would continue to attract danger. Moving away wasn't an option. Muriel loved this house, and Eustace was too stubborn to leave, so Courage would continue to defend it, continue to fight the land's ancient evils, continue to stand between his family and the darkness that lived beneath their home. There were nights when Courage came close to giving up. Not consciously, not as a deliberate decision, but in the way exhaustion and fear and accumulated trauma could grind someone down until they simply stopped moving. These moments were rare, but they happened, and they revealed the limits of even Courage's extraordinary endurance. One such night came after a week of consecutive threats, each one appearing before Courage had fully recovered from the previous encounter. A Monday night brought a creature that had to be fought for hours before it could be driven away. Tuesday brought a curse that required Courage to solve a complex puzzle while Muriel's life slowly drained away. Wednesday brought cats with yet another scheme. Thursday brought Laquack with a new disguise. Friday brought something that bent reality so severely that Courage lost track of time and space for what felt like days but was actually only hours. By Saturday night, when a new threat knocked on the door, Courage looked at it and felt nothing. Not fear, not determination, not even resignation. Just emptiness. He was so tired that his body felt like it was moving through water, every action requiring tremendous effort. His mind was foggy, unable to process information at its usual speed. And when the new threat, something with too many teeth and eyes, lunged toward Muriel, Courage found himself standing still instead of moving to intercept. Not because he had chosen to freeze, but because his body simply wouldn't respond. He had pushed too far, fought too long without rest, and now his reserves were completely depleted. Muriel screamed. The sound broke through Courage's fog, jolting him back into awareness just enough to move. He threw himself forward, managed to get between Muriel and the creature, took a hit that should have seriously injured him but barely registered through his exhaustion. And somehow, running on pure instinct and muscle memory, he fought the creature off and drove it away. When it was over, Courage collapsed on the floor and couldn't get up. Muriel rushed to him, frightened by how still he was, and carried him to her bed where she stayed up all night watching over him, worried that her beloved dog might not wake up. Courage did wake up, eventually, but the experience left a mark. He had come so close to failing, to being too exhausted to act, to letting Muriel be hurt because he couldn't push through one more time. The knowledge that he had limits, that there was a breaking point beyond which he couldn't function, terrified him in a way that monsters never had. What would happen if he reached that breaking point during a crisis? What would happen to Muriel if Courage simply couldn't fight anymore? Another near-breaking moment came during an encounter with a threat that specifically targeted Courage's mind. It was a psychic entity that fed on fear and had identified Courage as an abundant food source. Instead of attacking physically, it trapped Courage in his own memories, forcing him to relive every failure, every moment when he hadn't been fast enough, every night when Muriel had been hurt despite his efforts. The memories played on loop over and over, each repetition emphasizing Courage's inadequacy, his inability to fully protect the person he cared about most. Courage was trapped in this mental prison for what felt like weeks, though externally only a few hours passed. He watched himself fail again and again, saw Muriel hurt in countless ways, felt the weight of every mistake he had ever made. The psychic entity wanted Courage to believe he was useless, to accept that his efforts didn't matter, to give up fighting entirely so it could consume him completely. And for a moment, Courage almost did give up. The evidence seemed overwhelming. He was just a small, scared dog trying to fight forces far beyond his understanding. What right did he have to think he could protect anyone? But then, in one of the looped memories, Courage noticed something he had missed during the original event. Muriel's face after he had saved her. She was smiling, relieved, grateful. She had no idea how close danger had come, but she knew Courage had done something important. And seeing that smile again, even in a memory designed to torture him, reminded Courage of why the work mattered. He didn't have to be perfect. He didn't have to never fail. He just had to keep trying, keep fighting, keep standing between Muriel and danger as many times as it took. One success mattered more than 100 failures, because one success meant Muriel got to see another sunrise. That realization broke the psychic entity's hold. Courage snapped back to awareness in the real world, found the entity trying to feed on his unconscious body, and fought back with renewed determination. The entity fled, unable to sustain itself when its primary food source refused to despair. And Courage, though mentally exhausted, had learned something important. The breaking point wasn't just physical or mental, it was emotional. As long as he remembered why he fought, as long as Muriel's smile remained more powerful than his fear, he could keep going. There were other near-breaking moments scattered throughout this era. Times when injuries piled up and Courage had to fight through physical pain that would have incapacitated a human. Times when psychological attacks left him doubting reality and his own memories. Times when the sheer monotony of endless vigilance made him wonder if this was all his life would ever be. Fear, fighting, exhaustion, repeat. But Courage survived each moment, not through some superhuman resilience, but through the simple act of not quitting. He would feel himself breaking, feel the cracks forming in his ability to continue, and then he would just keep going anyway. One more step, one more fight, one more night. The near-breaking moments taught Courage humility. He wasn't invincible, wasn't limitless, wasn't the perfect protector he sometimes wished he could be. He was just a scared dog, doing his best in impossible circumstances, and sometimes his best wasn't quite enough, and sometimes he came within inches of complete failure. But almost failing wasn't the same as actually failing, and as long as Muriel woke up safe each morning, as long as the farmhouse still stood, Courage considered it a victory, no matter how narrow or how exhausting. Late in the timeline, after years of threats and countless nights of terror, Eustace Baggy remained fundamentally unchanged. He still sat in his chair, still read his newspaper, still called Courage "stupid dog," still kicked him out of the house for minor annoyances, still chased schemes and get-rich-quick plots that put the family in danger. Despite everything that had happened, or perhaps because nothing that happened ever registered in his memory, Eustace learned nothing, grew not at all, and continued to be the same bitter, greedy, cruel man he had been when Courage first arrived. This stagnation highlighted one of the deeper tragedies of Courage's situation. He had been protecting Eustace for years now, saving his life repeatedly, preventing him from being killed by monsters or cursed by ancient evils or scammed out of everything by con artists. And Eustace not only didn't appreciate these efforts, he actively made them harder through his constant antagonism toward Courage. Every insult, every kick, every moment of cruelty was Courage's reward for keeping Eustace alive. There were still moments when Eustace's greed brought danger directly into the house. One particularly bad incident involved Eustace accepting a free vacation from a mysterious company that turned out to be a front for an organ harvesting operation. The vacation destination was actually a remote facility where people were sedated and systematically stripped of valuable body parts to be sold on the black market. Eustace, excited by the promise of luxury at no cost, dragged Muriel along despite her misgivings. Courage, recognizing the danger immediately, had to infiltrate the facility, disable its operations, and rescue his owners before the harvesting could begin. When they escaped and returned home, Eustace's only complaint was that his vacation had been ruined by Courage causing trouble. He genuinely believed Courage had sabotaged a legitimate opportunity for luxury, and he spent weeks afterward being even crueler than usual, as if punishing Courage for the loss. Muriel tried to defend Courage, explaining that the facility had seemed dangerous and that they should be grateful to be home safely, but Eustace dismissed her concerns. He had wanted his free vacation, and Courage had ruined it, and that was all that mattered to him. Another incident involved Eustace finding what he thought was a money tree, a plant that allegedly grew currency instead of fruit. The tree was actually a parasitic entity that drained life force from its surroundings and converted that energy into realistic-looking bills. The bills were real enough to spend, which made Eustace ecstatic, but the tree was slowly killing everything around it, including Muriel and Courage himself. Courage tried to destroy the tree, but Eustace fought him, choosing potential wealth over the lives of those around him. Courage eventually succeeded in burning the tree, but not before it had drained a significant amount of life from both him and Muriel, leaving them weak for days afterward. Eustace never forgave him for destroying valuable property. What made Eustace's unchanging nature tragic wasn't just his cruelty toward Courage, it was the way it trapped everyone in a cycle that couldn't be broken. Muriel loved Eustace despite his flaws, and she wouldn't leave him or force him to change. Eustace needed protection but was too blind or stubborn to acknowledge the dangers around him, and Courage was caught between them, protecting a man who hated him in order to preserve the happiness of the woman who loved them both. There was no resolution to this dynamic, no moment where Eustace would suddenly appreciate Courage or stop putting the family in danger. It would just continue, day after day, until something or someone broke. Courage had long since stopped hoping that Eustace would change. That hope had died quietly after the first few dozen times Eustace had blamed him for problems that weren't his fault or kicked him for trying to warn about danger. Now Courage simply accepted Eustace as a fixed variable like the weather or the cursed ground beneath the farmhouse. Eustace would always be Eustace, selfish, cruel, oblivious, and perpetually angry at the world. Protecting him wasn't about redemption or earning gratitude, it was about keeping Muriel from experiencing the pain of losing her husband, no matter how unworthy that husband was of her love. There were nights when Courage would sit outside after a particularly difficult encounter, bruised and exhausted, and Eustace would open the door not to check if Courage was okay, but to yell at him for making noise or leaving footprints on the porch. And Courage would just take it, would let Eustace yell and threaten and insult, because responding would only make things worse and because ultimately Eustace's opinion didn't matter. What mattered was Muriel, safe inside, humming to herself while she prepared. breakfast for the next morning. That was worth enduring Eustace's cruelty. That was worth everything. The tragedy of Eustace also extended to moments when courage could have let him face consequences but chose not to. There were times when a monster had Eustace cornered, when a curse was specifically targeting him, when a con artist was about to clean him out completely, and courage could have simply not intervened, could have let Eustace learn a hard lesson about the dangers of nowhere, about the value of the protection he constantly dismissed. But courage never did. He always stepped in, always saved Eustace at the last moment, because letting Eustace get hurt meant hurting Muriel by extension, and that was unacceptable. So Eustace stayed Eustace, unchanged and unchanging, a constant source of danger and cruelty in Courage's life. And Courage stayed Courage, protecting someone who would never appreciate it, fighting battles that would never be acknowledged, enduring abuse for the sake of someone else's happiness. It was a tragic cycle with no end in sight, no possibility of improvement, no reward except the knowledge that Muriel could keep loving her husband because Courage refused to let that husband face the consequences of his own choices. And in the strange moral calculus of nowhere, that was enough. Not every threat that came to nowhere was world-ending or life-threatening. Some dangers were smaller, quieter, and resolved more through compassion than combat. These episodes weren't huge for lore or character development, but they mattered because they showed different facets of Courage's personality and reminded viewers that even in a place as cursed as nowhere, kindness could make a difference. One night, a small creature appeared at the farmhouse, something that looked like a mix between a bird and a cat, covered in soft feathers and clearly frightened. The creature wasn't attacking or causing trouble, it was just lost, separated from its family or home and seeking shelter from the harsh desert night. Muriel wanted to help it, but Eustace was convinced it would cause problems and wanted it gone. Courage, who had plenty of experience with scary-looking but harmless beings, recognized that this creature wasn't a threat. What followed was a gentle episode where Courage helped the creature find its way home. He couldn't communicate with it directly, but he could read its body language, understand when it relaxed or became anxious, and follow the subtle cues that indicated which direction felt right to it. Together, they traveled through the desert at night, navigating terrain that would have been dangerous for the creature alone. Courage protected it from a few minor threats, a snake, a patch of unstable ground, and eventually brought it to a cave system where others of its kind lived. The creatures welcomed their lost member back, and one of them made a gesture toward Courage that clearly meant gratitude before they all disappeared into the caves. Courage returned to the farmhouse as the sun was rising, tired but satisfied. Muriel was awake and worried about where he had been, but when she saw him return safely, she just smiled and gave him breakfast. The episode had no grand revelations, no major battles, no lasting consequences. It was just Courage, choosing to help someone who needed it, even though he gained nothing from the action and could have easily ignored the creature's presence. And that choice mattered because it showed that Courage's protective instincts extended beyond Muriel to anyone or anything that seemed lost or scared. Another quiet episode involved a misunderstanding with what appeared to be a monster, but was actually just a very ugly, very lonely creature who wanted companionship. It had been knocking on doors throughout nowhere, desperate to find someone who would talk to it, and everyone who saw it ran away screaming because of its appearance. When it knocked on the Bage farmhouse door, Eustace slammed the door in its face and Muriel was too frightened to approach. Only Courage, after his initial panic subsided, noticed that the creature wasn't doing anything threatening. It was just standing there, looking sad. Courage cautiously approached and realized the creature was trying to communicate, though its voice came out as horrifying sounds that seemed threatening but were actually just attempts at friendly conversation. Courage couldn't fix the creature's appearance or voice, but he could spend time with it, could show it that at least one being in nowhere wasn't afraid. They sat together on the porch for a while, the creature making its unsettling sounds and Courage listening patiently, and when the creature finally left, it seemed less lonely than before. It was a small kindness, nothing that would be remembered or celebrated, but it meant something to both of them. There was another episode where Courage encountered a ghost who was trapped in a cycle of reliving their worst memory, unable to move on or find peace. The ghost wasn't hurting anyone, it was just stuck, repeating the same actions over and over in a corner of the farmhouse attic. Courage could have ignored it, could have left the ghost to its eternal loop, but instead he investigated, figured out what memory the ghost was trapped in, and found a way to change the memory's ending. He located an object that had meaning to the ghost, brought it to the attic, and placed it where the ghost could see it during the next loop. The ghost noticed, the memory shifted, and the cycle broke. The ghost faded away peacefully, finally able to rest. These softer episodes didn't follow the usual pattern of danger, fight, survive. They were about courage choosing compassion when he could have chosen indifference, about recognizing that not every problem needed to be solved with violence or panic. They showed that despite years of trauma and constant fear, courage hadn't become hardened or cruel. He could still recognize suffering in others and still feel compelled to help, even when helping required effort and offered no reward. One particularly gentle episode involved Muriel trying to plant a garden, something she had wanted to do for years, but could never get to grow in Nowhere's hostile soil. Every plant she tried to cultivate would wither and die within days, and Muriel was becoming discouraged. Courage noticed her sadness and decided to help, staying up at night to protect the young plants from the various creatures and conditions that threatened them. He chased away insects that tried to eat the sprouts, redirected harsh winds, and even found a small underground spring that he could tap to provide better water. After weeks of Courage's secret nighttime efforts, the garden began to thrive. Muriel was delighted, convinced she had finally figured out the right technique, never knowing that Courage had been working behind the scenes to make it possible. Eustace complained about having to eat vegetables, but Muriel was happy, and she would sometimes sit in her garden in the evening, humming softly, and Courage would watch from nearby, satisfied that he had given her this small piece of joy in a place that offered so little. These quiet victories didn't change the fundamental nature of Nowhere, or solve the larger problems facing the Bagay family. The threats would keep coming, the dangers would continue, and Courage would still spend most of his nights fighting for survival. But the soft episodes provided breathing room, moments where Courage could express parts of his character that weren't defined by fear and violence. They reminded both Courage and the audience that heroism wasn't just about fighting monsters, it was also about choosing kindness, offering help to those who needed it, and creating small moments of peace in a chaotic world. By this point in the timeline, Courage had been protecting the Bagay farmhouse for so long that the rhythm of danger had become almost predictable. Not in the sense that he knew what specific threat would arrive next. Nowhere was too chaotic for that, but in the sense that he understood the pattern. Something would knock, something would threaten, Courage would act, the threat would be defeated or driven away, morning would come, the cycle would repeat. What had changed over time wasn't the danger level or the frequency of threats. If anything, they had intensified slightly, with more sophisticated villains and more complex supernatural phenomena appearing regularly. What had changed was Courage himself. The constant fear was still there, that would never go away. But it was accompanied now by a kind of steady competence, a confidence in his ability to handle whatever came next, even if he couldn't predict what it would be. This steadiness showed in small ways during encounters. Courage no longer wasted time panicking before acting. The panic and action happened simultaneously now, his body moving while his mind screamed in terror. He made fewer mistakes, having learned through experience which tactics worked in which situations. He recovered faster from setbacks, adapting his plans on the fly when initial approaches failed, and he carried himself differently, even when terrified. There was a resolve in his movements that hadn't been there in the early days, a sense that he had decided long ago to keep fighting no matter what, and had simply stopped questioning that decision. One night demonstrated this evolution clearly. Multiple threats arrived at the farmhouse simultaneously. A coordinated attack, though whether it was planned or just bad luck was unclear. Cats appeared with a new scheme involving the farmhouse's plumbing system. A cursed storm descended on Nowhere, bringing lightning that struck with impossible accuracy. A group of smaller creatures tried to infiltrate through various entry points, and something massive stirred beneath the ground, threatening to collapse the foundation. Years ago, facing even one of these threats would have pushed Courage to his limits. Now, facing all of them at once, he simply prioritized and moved. First, the foundation problem, because if the house collapsed, nothing else mattered. Courage raced to the basement, found the point where the underground disturbance was strongest, and drove a metal rod into the ground, something he had prepared months ago for exactly this kind of situation. The rod disrupted whatever was moving below, buying time. Second, the infiltrating creatures, because they were closest to Muriel. Courage sealed the entry points using furniture and tools he had strategically placed around the house over time. third, the storm, which required Courage to climb onto the roof during dangerous weather and destroy a small device that was attracting lightning, likely something Katz had planted earlier. And finally, Katz himself, who Courage found and chased off the property before the cat could complete whatever plumbing sabotage he had planned. The entire sequence took less than 2 hours. Courage was exhausted and injured by the end, but all threats were neutralized. Muriel never woke up, and the house remained standing. Years ago, that same combination of threats would have resulted in catastrophe. Now it was just another Tuesday night in nowhere. The difference wasn't that Courage had become fearless or more powerful, it was that he had become practiced. He knew his environment, knew his capabilities, knew the patterns that most threats followed, and could navigate complex situations with the kind of efficiency that only came from doing something over and over until it became second nature. This steadiness also showed in how Courage handled recurring villains. When Katz returned for the 20th time, Courage no longer felt the same spike of terror he had during their first encounter. He felt tired recognition instead, a weary acceptance that this was happening again, and he would deal with it the same way he always did. When Laquack appeared in yet another disguise, Courage spotted him within minutes rather than hours, having learned to recognize the duck's tells so thoroughly that no costume could fully hide them. The recurring threats were still dangerous, still required full effort to defeat, but they had lost their ability to truly surprise Courage. The steady competence came with a cost, though. Courage had become so focused on survival and protection that he had lost some of the emotional range he once had. He still loved Muriel, still fought desperately to keep her safe, but other feelings had faded. He rarely felt joy anymore, except in brief moments when Muriel smiled at him. He didn't feel triumph when he defeated threats, just relief that it was over. He didn't feel curiosity about the nature of Nowhere's supernatural elements, just pragmatic interest in identifying weaknesses. The constant vigilance had narrowed his emotional life down to fear, determination, and love for Muriel, with little room for anything else. But Courage was okay with that trade-off. Emotions were a luxury he couldn't afford when Muriel's safety was at stake. If becoming steadier meant becoming emotionally narrower, that was fine. If competence required sacrificing parts of himself that weren't directly useful for protection, so be it. The mission was all that mattered. Keep Muriel safe, keep the farmhouse standing, survive until morning. Everything else, joy, curiosity, hope for something better, could be set aside as long as that mission continued. There were still nights when the old fear broke through the steadiness, when a particularly horrible threat or a near miss with Muriel's safety would remind Courage how close he always was to failing. Those moments were valuable in their own way because they kept him sharp, prevented him from becoming complacent. But they were becoming rarer, and Courage wasn't sure if that was good or bad. Was he adapting to Nowhere's horrors in a healthy way, or was he slowly losing the parts of himself that made the fighting worthwhile? He didn't know, and most nights he was too tired to care. What mattered was that the farmhouse still stood, Muriel still woke up each morning safe and happy, and Courage still had the strength to face another night of terror. The world wasn't getting safer, would never get safer as long as they lived in Nowhere. But Courage had gotten steadier, more capable, more resigned to his role as the eternal guardian of a house that refused to acknowledge how much danger it was in. And in Nowhere, where nothing ever truly changed except to get worse, staying steady was its own kind of victory. As the timeline approached something that felt like an ending but wasn't really an ending, because in Nowhere there were no true endings, just pauses between threats. Courage found himself reflecting on what had become normal. The farmhouse still stood in the middle of the desert. Muriel still hummed to herself while cooking. Eustace still complained about everything. And Courage still stood watch, waiting for the next knock on the door. The threats had never stopped coming. Even now, after years of defending the farmhouse, Courage couldn't remember more than a few consecutive nights when nothing had happened. Sometimes the dangers were small and easily handled. Sometimes they were massive and took everything Courage had to survive. But they were constant, reliable in their unreliability, and Courage had long since accepted that this was simply how life worked in Nowhere. The desert attracted the strange, the cursed, and the dangerous. The farmhouse sat exposed and vulnerable, in the middle of it all, and Courage would spend the rest of his life fighting to protect the people inside. There were no grand revelations in this final era, no ultimate villain to defeat or final curse to break. Cats still circled the farmhouse periodically, trying new schemes. Laquack still showed up in increasingly ridiculous disguises. Cursed objects still arrived through the mail. Reality still bent in disturbing ways. And Courage still handled each threat the same way he had learned to handle them: observe, adapt, improvise, survive. The pattern had become so ingrained that Courage could execute it while barely conscious, his body moving through familiar rhythms even when his mind was exhausted. What had changed, subtly but significantly, was Courage's relationship with the role he had taken on. In the early days, he had been a scared dog, forced into circumstances beyond his control, fighting because he had no choice and surviving through desperate luck. Over time, he had become competent but resentful, carrying out his duties while wishing things could be different. But now, after so many years, Courage had reached a kind of acceptance. This was his life. This was who he was. The farmhouse guardian, the silent protector, the frightened dog who kept finding courage when it mattered most. He didn't need the world to acknowledge what he did. He didn't need Eustace to stop being cruel or for the threats to finally leave them alone. He just needed Muriel to wake up each morning safe and happy, to keep being the kind person who had found him when he had nothing. That single goal had sustained him through countless impossible nights, and it would continue to sustain him for as long as he had strength left. Muriel, for her part, remained wonderfully unchanged. She still trusted strangers too easily, still believed the world was fundamentally good, still offered kindness to anyone who seemed to need it. The farmhouse's reset effect protected her from the full weight of the horrors that surrounded her, allowing her to maintain an innocence that would have been destroyed years ago if she fully remembered everything that had happened. Courage was grateful for that protection, even as he carried all the memories she didn't have to keep. There were quiet moments now, more than there used to be, where Courage would sit with Muriel in the evening and just exist in her presence. She would knit or read or watch television, and Courage would rest his head on her lap, and for those brief periods, nowhere felt less like a cursed landscape and more like home. The danger was still out there, waiting just beyond the windows, but inside the farmhouse, with Muriel's gentle hand stroking his head, Courage could almost believe things were normal. Eustace remained the same bitter presence he had always been, but even that had become normal. Courage no longer expected Eustace to change or appreciate him. The old farmer was part of the household's ecosystem, now like the cursed ground beneath the foundation or the desert wind that never stopped blowing. He would cause problems, Courage would fix them, and life would continue. It wasn't fair, wasn't satisfying, but it was stable in its own dysfunctional way. As time passed, Courage occasionally encountered new threats that brought back old fears. A creature that reminded him of something from his earliest days in Nowhere, when everything was new and terrifying. A curse that operated similarly to ones he had broken years ago. A villain whose tactics echoed cats or Laquack or one of the other recurring predators. These encounters proved that Courage's job would never be finished, that there would always be something new trying to hurt his family. But they also proved that Courage could handle it, had always been able to handle it, would continue handling it for as long as Muriel needed him. The desert around Nowhere remained as weird and hostile as ever. Strange lights still moved across the horizon at night. Sounds without sources still echoed through the dark. The land still remembered its ancient curses and occasionally tried to assert them. But the farmhouse endured, reset itself after each attack, and continued to serve as home for a kind elderly woman, her bitter husband, and the frightened dog who loved her enough to face impossible horrors every single night. And that was enough. Not perfect, not safe, not even particularly happy most of the time. But enough. Courage had learned to find value in the small victories. Another sunrise, another breakfast with Muriel, another day where the people he protected were still alive, and the house was still standing. The larger questions, why Nowhere was cursed, whether they would ever escape the cycle, whether Courage would ever get to rest, had faded into irrelevance. What mattered was the immediate, the concrete, the achievable. Protect Muriel. Survive the night. Face tomorrow. In the final quiet moments of this timeline, Courage sat by the farmhouse window as evening descended, watching the desert turn orange and purple under the setting sun. Somewhere out there, another threat was probably forming, another danger preparing to knock on the door. But for now, in this moment, everything was still. Muriel was humming in the kitchen, Eustace was snoring in his chair, and Courage stood watch, as he always had and always would, because this was his purpose and his choice and his love made manifest. The world outside remained full of impossible things. Courage remained terrified of almost all of them. But Muriel remained safe, and that made every moment of terror worthwhile. This wasn't a happy ending because there were no endings in nowhere. But it was a lasting normal, a sustainable routine, a life that Courage had fought to preserve and would continue fighting to maintain for as long as he drew breath. The desert wind whispered against the windows. The stars began to appear in the darkening sky. And Courage, the cowardly dog who had found courage in the most unlikely place, kept his vigil. Because somewhere in the darkness beyond the farmhouse, danger was waiting. And when it knocked, as it inevitably would, Courage would answer, afraid, always afraid, but moving forward anyway. Because that was what courage really meant in Nowhere. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear win. After countless nights of terror and years of protecting those who would never fully understand the dangers they faced, Courage's story reaches this quiet point. Not an ending, but a continuation of the same vigilant watch that had defined his entire life since Muriel found him. The farmhouse stood. Muriel was safe. Eustace complained. The desert remained weird. And Courage, faithful and frightened, kept doing what he had always done, standing between his family and the darkness that surrounded them, one terrified act of bravery at a time.